Bernardo Kastrup, it's a pleasure to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me again, Simon. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
It's a pleasure to speak to you. I've been fortunate enough to speak to you at length on two previous occasions, both times with Rupert Spira. And this time, I'm getting to talk to you about your new book, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. And I want to start by congratulating you because I think that I'm very aware of the scientific and philosophical rigor with which you've approached your work. And I have other of your books, but this one for me is the one that is so digestible. I was so able to get my head around it and briefly. And so I'm really excited about the potential impact it can have to people who are new to these ideas. So, first of all, I want to just start by saying congratulations. It's a must read. And I mean that.
Thank you. What I tried to achieve with this book was to be more accessible, like short, to the point. No long, rigorous argument. It's still rigorous in its own way, but it is short. That's what I tried to achieve.
It's short and it's understandable and it's a page turner. And I've already told you, I'm a bit evangelical about it, and I do have done hundreds of interviews with people about books. But honestly, this is definitely very near the top of the pile in terms of one I'm telling and urging my listeners to read. I think it's really, really important.
Thank you.
So
Oh, by the
I
way,
think, go
it's
on.
a never before seen event. Frig, my other cat, is making me company today. It's usually
Oh,
Floki.
nice. Well, I have two cats too, and fortunately, they're not here, so that's
I
okay.
have four. I have
Oh
four
wow,
actually.
nice, nice. Um, Right. Before we dive into the book, Bernardo, or rather how I want to dive into the book, is kind of to start at the end in terms of the implications of what we are going to talk about analytical idealism, which has very close crossovers with non duality. And the question, so what? And often I get asked this. People will talk to me, okay, but I've still got to get up and go to work. So what? What is the point of this? And so I've thought about that a bit. And I thought about it again after reading this. And so I just want to quickly share what I would consider to be my two reasons why this is important, particularly in light of reading your stuff. And then I would like you to share yours as well. So for me, the two go like this. One is the implications for death, in terms of we tend to think that it's the end and we will disappear into oblivion, into nothing. But actually, the implications of this are pretty much the opposite. The dissociative boundary will go, and we recognize we are and always have been all of it. So it's as if waking up from a dream. So that's one. That's a pretty big implication. And then the other one is this recognition, or that Bernardo and Simon and everyone around the world is, on one level, a unique expression of humanity. There will never be another Bernardo with your thoughts and feelings and experiences. Same for me, same for everyone. But the I at the center of the experience, the experiencing I, the field of subjectivity, as you call it, is the same in you, in me, in our cats, etc. And the implications, therefore, in terms of the way we live our lives is massive, because that old saying of treat your neighbor like yourself, it's not just an urge because it's the right thing to do. No, if you hurt your neighbor, you are literally hurting yourself at a deep level. And I often say that it kind of does the heavy lifting, I find, for me in terms of making me suffer less and making me a somewhat kinder person over time without effort. So those are two, I think, pretty big implications. Over to you.
Well, for me, when it started with a confrontation with the inadequacy of physicalism, which is the metaphysics I sort of adopted uncritically early in my life. So when I thought my way through into idealism, at first it was conceptual, it was in my head. And it didn't change much because nothing that is purely conceptual changes lives, right? Doesn't change the way you feel, doesn't change the way you live. It's up in your head and there it stays. But one thing that Rupert Spira predicted years ago when I was having dinner with him, he said, it will sink in. Right now, it may be only conceptual, but without your noticing it, at some point, you will inhabit it. And at the time, I thought, no way, I'm too hard headed for this. I don't have any spiritual skills, or I'm not predisposed to it. I'm just a thinker, no scientist. But it did happen. It snuck upon me. It went down and took me over. And when I realized, I was already embodying it. So many things changed. The same that changed for you were the first things I noticed. My relationship with death is very different. It's no longer that of oblivion. I experienced that in a more difficult way than you seem to do, because there is something reassuring about death under physicalism, which is that all of your problems and suffering come to an end, whether you like it or not. Under idealism, the subject is always there. It's the configuration, the mental state of the subject that changes. So the space for suffering, the potential for suffering stays, and death becomes again what it has been for 99% of human history, which is the great unknown. We don't know what it would really be like when you are in a less dissociated or non-dissociated state and you experience the universe as yourself. You are the universe now instead of just perceiving the universe, and I don't know how that will feel like. So I have some anxiety about that. Even a psychedelic trip that only reduces your brain and metabolism a bit, it leads to ego dissolution and amazing states that are sometimes very difficult. Imagine when your brain metabolism comes to a complete end. So yeah, I have some anxiety about it. On the positive side, I don't struggle with the question of meaning anymore. Life is just swimming in meaning. It's all over me. So like I hear other people reporting that you wake up in the morning and you have to struggle to tell yourself a story to give meaning to what you're about to do. What is this all for? At the end, we're going to die anyway. And what is this all about? There's no point, no reason, no telos, no meaning. Well, that is that has disappeared from my life. It has vanished. It's vanished from my life in the way that the question of meaning vanished from my life in the way that water has vanished from the life of fish, because it's so
Mm.
all encompassing that it disappears. It's a constant. It's always there. So that's good. I don't have to deal with nihilism, depression. All of that stuff is gone. Um, Empathy has grown a lot, which I experienced as very difficult, because that I was not naturally empathic as a kid and as a young adult. So I never had to develop defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms. How do you cope with empathy? And then in my 40s, because of the implications of analytic idealism sinking into the body, it's no longer a theory for me, it's a lived reality. Empathy has grown, and I had no coping mechanisms for it. So, recent events like when the war in Ukraine began and the situation in Israel and Gaza, I was dysfunctional for a while. You're just overwhelmed with seeing the world through those people's eyes, um, and and that helps nobody, right? To become dysfunctional doesn't help me and doesn't help them either, right? So that was difficult for me. Another thing, I don't want to sound negative, but I'm trying to be honest. Another thing that was difficult for me is what I call the vertigo of eternity. Um, when the idea that the subject in you, the thing that is looking out to the world from behind your eyes, which is not Simon, it's subjectivity. Simon is a narrative. It's that those words that go, well, I am Simon, I was born that day in that place, I'm married to this person, I do this for a living. That's a narrative. It's the experiencer of that that is always going to be there. When this is just conceptual, it's nice, right? Oh, I'm never going to die. What I really am, I'm never going to die. Oh, that's fantastic. No worries anymore, right? No oblivion. But when it sinks in, there and there is this thing called this vertigo of eternity, meaning when this becomes not just a story that you like, but a reality, and it's really real. Um, how do I describe that? It takes you aback sometimes. Um, it, it
Existential terror?
it's a kind of terror, yeah, because you're never going to die. You're always, 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 without end, going to be there. This is this can freak me out. Sometimes it comes at me from the left field when I'm not sort of guarded against it and ready to rationalize it and put it in a little drawer in my conceptual mind. It has its place and it's there. No, when it really catches me unprepared, like when I'm falling asleep or waking up, when you're in a hypnagogic or hypnopompic state, or when you're distracted by other things, and it catches you off guard, and sometimes I go like, no,
Yeah.
it freaks me out sometimes. So for me, there are good things like nihilism disappears, meaning is a constant. Um, you're a better human being. You're more human because of empathy. But it's not all a sea of roses. I'm not very romantic about it. No, it has been a learning curve for me, to cope with empathy, to cope with the vertigo of eternity, to cope with death anxiety in a very different way, because it's not oblivion anymore that I'm anxious about. I'm
Yeah.
anxious about what it's going to feel like
Yeah.
uh, when there is no nice personal self that I can sort of become attached to. When you are the very ocean of everything that is happening. So yeah, um, I think it makes us better human beings, but it's tough. It's a tough thing to embody, to live.
I agree with what you pointed to there. I share that anxiety about the potential implications, and I don't think it's perhaps even a coincidence that empathy you speak of, and as I mentioned too, that kindness has become more pronounced when you consider that to a certain degree. And actually, the that what did you call it? The of eternity. Sorry,
The
the
vertigo of
But
eternity.
yeah, that brought to mind. So when I was a child, I used to have night terrors, and they were very specific. You know the story. I think it's Sisyphus, the guy who had to roll the rock up. I
Up
used
the
to
hill.
have that as a night terror, and it was awful because it was like eternity, and it stayed with me. And my wife, I can get perhaps onto the experience I had with her. Put it this way: she's quite powerful, regressed me in a Reiki way, and I went back to that experience, and that is that is existential terror. Like that. It was utterly terrifying, and similarly on psychedelics as well. But anyway, well, I think that's an interesting place to start, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, including psychedelics. But right, let's work our way through, as it were, and we'll start with where you say about what you see is not what you get, which
Yeah.
is, I think, the key point, right? We set aside this notion that we see the world as it is. I'm fortunate enough to have interviewed and spoken to Professor Donald Hoffman as well, who, put it in terms of evolutionary game theory. But once we get this, everything else opens up.
Yeah, we are normally naive realists because evolutionarily speaking, it makes sense for us to be that. We think that perception is a transparent window, that the world we perceive is the world as it actually is. Well, not even physicalism would say that. Even physicalism would say the colors you see are not out there. There are no qualities out there. It's all in your head. But physicalism would get closer to realism by saying that the geometrical relationships, the contours of the world, the silhouettes, the outlines, they're really out there. You fill them in with color and qualities and all that stuff. But even that is not awarded by reason and evidence. We have every reason to understand perception as a dashboard of dials. Like an airplane, which has sensors, it measures the states of the world and then encodes those measurements and presents them to the pilots in the form of dashboard indications. And the pilots have to take the dashboard seriously because the dashboard does convey accurate and important information about the world, but it isn't the world. The sky outside the airplane is not the dashboard, nor does it look like the dashboard. But we are pilots who were born in an airplane without windows. And all we ever had was the dashboard. So we take the dashboard for the world. That's why we think the world is physical. Physical stuff is what appears on the screen of perception, the stuff we can touch, smell, taste, see, hear. That's physical stuff, colloquially speaking. We take that to be the world. We think the world is physical. While every line of reasoning I have come across shows us that no, physicality is a dashboard representation. It's really just a dashboard, not what is being measured by the sensors. The world as it is not physical in any reasonable sense of the world of the word physical. And the only other type of state that we know of that is not amenable to physical description are mental states. Like we can't describe a thought in centimeters or in kilograms or in joules, coulombs, in seconds. Now, we can't describe a thought like that. A thought or an emotion are fundamentally qualitative states. You cannot provide an exhaustive quantitative description of a fundamentally qualitative state. So, thoughts are non physical in that sense. They are not amenable to exhaustive physical descriptions. That's the only other kind of state we know, which leads to the very reasonable inference, and in my view, the best inference we can make, that the world as it actually is, the sky behind the dashboard, our mental is made of mental states, not your mental states, not my mental states out there, mental states that we cannot influence merely by wishing them to be different, that will not be amenable to our fantasies. They are what they are, and they would still be that even if we were not here, but mental nonetheless, just as my thoughts are mental and they are not part of your mind, and my thoughts would still be here even if you were not there, and yet my thoughts are mental. So in that sense, we have every reason to think that the world is mental, not your mind, but it's mental, mentation out there, and that matter is what mentation looks like when viewed from the outside. Which, if you think about it, it's almost obvious. My thoughts and emotions present themselves to outside observation as the matter that constitutes my body. My brain activity are material processes, physical processes, and my brain activity is what my mental inner life looks like when observed from the outside, from a second or third person perspective, right? And the matter that constitutes my body, it's the same atoms and fields that constitutes the rest of the world. So the rest of the world too must be what mental processes look like when represented on a dashboard. It's once you understand this, it's
Yeah.
so obvious, it's painful, one even needs to argue for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Donald Hoffman uses the comparison of a computer screen in that, and I find this very helpful in that, if I have a Word document and I drag it into the bin and I have something important in that Word document, I lose something of significance, but that doesn't mean there's actually a paper document or indeed a bin there. It's representations of a much more complex process that if you had to go through in terms of the ones and the zeros, it would take you forever and you'd die trying to do it. And
Yeah.
so in much that same way. And so then that can shine a light on the brain itself, which is this other key belief that the brain produces mind, the brain creates thoughts, etc. But actually, before we go there, if we go back to, well, we don't see things as they are, but as a representation, it means that what we see as the brain, as this lump of tofu, basically, jelly like, and looks a certain way, is not what it looks like. It's not actually this, this jelly like substance at all. And we've got to be open to that
Yeah.
reality.
And you know that from first-hand experience. I mean, imagine you are consumed by heartbreak. Your wife, the love of your life, doesn't want to have you in her life anymore, and you're going to divorce, and you're heartbroken. You know what that is like, what the reality of the feeling of heartbreak is like. We have direct access to our own mental states. We know them from a first-person perspective. We know the thing in itself, insofar as it comes to our own mental states. So you know what heartbreak is like, but if a scientist were to put you in an fMRI scanner, functional MRI scanner, to read your brain activity as you go through the throes of heartbreak, that scientist would see a very physical process, patterns of neurons firing, according to some complexes of with reentrant loops, like IIT predicts. Very material stuff. So material stuff is the external appearance of the real thing. But what is the real thing? Well, heartbreak. And can you know the real thing? Of course you can. It's all you know. We all know the real thing. The only jump that we need to make is to understand that what applies to you and your brain activity and your heartbreak applies to everything, because your body too is made of the same atoms and force fields as everything else. So if matter, the matter of your body, is what your heartbreak looks like from the outside, then the rest of the physical material universe is what something looks like from the outside. What is that something from its own first person perspective? Well, that is what it is like to be the universe.
Yeah.
That is what it is like to be God, if you want to use the G word.
Yeah. Which is dangerous territory, isn't it?
Very.
Yeah. Um, so this belief that the brain produces mind, so thoughts and feelings and perceptions. In fact, quickly define mind, Bernardo, for me in how you would.
I use the word mind as a synonymous of phenomenal consciousness. In other words, if there is a mind, then there is something it is like to be. If a state is mental, then there is something it is like to be in that state. There are qualities associated with it. Mind is that whose excitations are what we call experiences. Every experience is an excitation of a mind. So, mind is that whose excitations are experiences.
So mind is experiencing, according to your definition.
Yeah, if you have an experience, there has to be a subject of experience. There has to be a dative of experience, that to which experience is given. So we can call that mind, but we have to avoid creating the idea that there are two things, the experience and the mind that experiences. Because if you do that, then you run into all kinds of philosophical problems. Like you can't make sense of why a mind which is different from an experience, why that mind experiences anything, since experience is something else. You run into the interaction problem of dualism. So to avoid that, the way to think about it is to think of experiences as, say, the vibrations of a guitar string, and of mind as the guitar string, or to think of experiences as ripples on a lake and mind as the lake. Because if you do that and then you realize that there is nothing to a ripple but the lake doing something, you can't take the ripple home with you, take it out of the lake. You can't take the note produced by a guitar string home with you and leave the guitar string behind. There's nothing to the note but the guitar string in movement. There is nothing to the ripple but the lake in movement. In the same way, there's nothing to experience but mind in movement. And then you avoid dualisms, you avoid all kinds of problems like the interaction problem, and everything sort of ties up neatly at the end.
And yet, the mainstream model of things is that the ripple creates the lake, right? Insofar as what we experience, so we experience a brain, we perceive a brain, we see a brain, we can touch a brain. I've never done it, but you could probably smell a brain, etc. And from that, most people, 99% of people, believe, without, in most cases, I've realized, without even realizing they believe it, assume that the brain creates mind. But there's no evidence for that. That is a belief, not a fact, isn't it?
I think when it began, it was understandable. I think it's unforgivable today for
Yeah.
21st century thinkers. I think it's unforgivable to insist on what is now obviously an error, but its start is understandable. Oh, by the way, brains do smell. I'm not going to get into it, but they,
Good
they
to know.
do
Good to
smell.
know.
Um, the origin of the belief is a kind of lazy thinking. It's a face value thinking. There are obvious correlations between brain activity, which is measurable and physical in the colloquial sense, meaning that you can describe it through numbers, and experiences, on the other hand. These two are very nicely correlated. They are not fully correlated. We're probably not going to get into this today, but as far as this question is concerned, we could even pretend that they are fully always correlated. It will still work well, what I'm about to say. And of course, the easiest explanation for A and B being correlated is that A causes B or B causes A. And because we are in a materialist society, well, we think matter causes mind as opposed to mind causing matter. Of course, the third option is A and B are both caused by C, but that gets more involved and complicated. So this is the first line of argument, face value argument, lazy, vulgar thinking, as we say in philosophy. Vulgar doesn't mean morally bad; it means superficial, unsophisticated, face value thinking. The two are correlated, so one must generate the other. And then the second argument would be the illusion of causation, which presupposes a form of dualism. And it goes like this: if I take a very physical needle and I stick it in your arm, you will experience pain. So a material cause leads to a mental effect. Therefore, matter causes mind, because it's the effect that is mental and the cause is material. Now, this is even worse because it's not even face value thinking, it's just mistaken reasoning, because it presupposes dualism. It presupposes a physical cause and a mental effect that are in different ontological domains. An idealist would say everything is mind. There is only mental to mental causation. The needle you see is a dashboard representation of a mental process. Sticking that needle in your arm means that you're bringing that external mental process into your internal mentation. And that has a mental effect called pain. So it's mental cause, mental effect. There's no issue here. That's how an idealist would think. Um, the problem with these two face value arguments is that it creates an insoluble problem, because how can something that is exhaustively describable in terms of numbers, namely physical stuff, the brain, you can put a numerical description of the position, charge, momentum of every single elementary particle in your brain, so you can have a fully quantitative description of the brain. You will have said, with a list of the right numbers, everything there is to be said about what it is to be a brain. Not what it is like, but what a brain is. Um, and yet, you will have said nothing about the qualities of experience. You can't describe what it is like to be heartbroken with a list of numbers. You can't describe what it is like to see red with a list of numbers. Oh, Bernardo, 375 terahertz. No, that tells me nothing about what it is like to actually see red. You gave me a description of the physical world, but you didn't describe the experience of seeing red. If I were colorblind and I couldn't see red, you would have told me nothing about what it is like to see red by giving me a number. And this explanatory gap from physicality to mentation is a big problem. And in modern language, it's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is not hard; it's impossible, because it's a inner contradiction of a wrong line of thinking. If you say the brain causes the mind, you cannot have an impassable chasm between the two. You have to be able to bridge them. And it has been shown that it's not only in practice impossible to bridge them, it's impossible in principle. In other words, it's senseless. And the reason is so obvious. Physicality, we invented numbers to describe the contents of perception. Numbers are a description. Like you want to describe to somebody what it will feel like to lift a heavy piece of luggage. You can say 50 kilograms. It's a description of an experience. And if you want to describe what it is like to drive from my home to Munich, like I'll have to do in January, you could describe that by saying 800 kilometers. But that's a description of an experience. It is not a thing. There are no 50 kilograms in and of itself. 50 kilograms is a description. It's like a map that describes a territory. But then we try to say that the descriptions precede the thing described. We try to say that the map precedes the territory, and if you reach into the map, you can pull the territory out of it. That's what we are doing when we try to say the brain creates the mind. Well, no, the brain is a map of the mind. It's an appearance on a dashboard that can be described, but it's not the thing in itself. It's a description. If you give ontological precedence to the description, you will fall into an error. You can't recover the territory from the map, right? You start from the territory and then you describe it through the map. Um, so when we try to say how can we bridge from brain to mind, we are trying to extract the territory from the map. We are trying to put the descriptions ahead of the thing described, and that's why it's impossible. That's why it's not the hard problem of consciousness, but the impossible, incoherent problem of consciousness. And you can account for all the correlations by just saying, no, the brain is not what causes the mind. The brain is what the mind looks like when a mind is observed from the outside, and they are still fully correlated. And all causation is mental. So the needle is not a thing. The needle is a representation of a mental process that that works as a mental cause to a mental effect, feeling the pain when you stick the needle in my arm. Everything closes nicely without leading to any of these impossible problems if we think of the entirety of nature as mental processes.
Just quickly, Bernardo, in terms of experience, this is kind of how I think of it, is that anything that we experience, and I have to briefly, for the purpose of this, seem to separate the experiencer from the experience, but I don't, we'll bring that back. But everything that we experience, for example, this glass, there first has to be an experiencer there for it to be experienced. The subjectivity has to be there to experience the object, as it were. But what the hard problem does, really bizarrely, from my point of view, is just flip that around. It's like, no, the object gives rise to the very thing that experiences it and could ever experience it. And to me, it's you're nodding. So just quickly, can you respond to that? Seems to me to me to be a simple way of being like, God, this is crazy.
It is absolutely crazy. Um, there are people, serious scholars out there, who would even deny that an experience requires an experiencer or a subject. They would even deny that. There are people out there who get paid by your tax money because they are university professors who deny even that there is such a thing as qualitative experience. They think consciousness is an illusion. They are illusionists or eliminativists. So we should not underestimate the potential of the human mind to tie itself in knots in order to not abandon its belief system. You can engage in what I call very sophisticated bullshit. You know, PhD level bullshit. There is such a thing. It's the most dangerous bullshit there is. It's PhD level bullshit. Is when the obvious conclusion is staring you in the face, but you don't like it. So you have to find a way to go around it. And you do that by creating many, many levels of conceptual abstraction. So many levels that at some point you just wave your hands in front of you and say, and therefore there is no subject. um, I, I find that phenomenon very interesting from a
Yeah,
psychological perspective. I would like to do a psychological study of these people, which is, of course, not possible because they would not volunteer. They would say, you're patronizing me, get out of here. I think future generations will study this. They will study how physicalism or materialism, which is the worst metaphysical option ever to be seriously entertained by human beings, became mainstream
yeah,
for 400 years, which
yeah,
is nothing in the cultural history of humanity. 400 years, in view of 30 or 50,000, it's nothing. But it's enough that I think there will be grants given by universities 100 years from now to study how we could have taken ourselves in so badly into in your face nonsense.
yeah.
How did that happen?
No,
The whole psychological dynamics behind it's exquisitely interesting. But if you are not a priori trying to defend a certain position just because that's the position you think that you identify with, so you will find any convoluted way to try to defend it. If you don't do that, if you're just neutral and you take a step back and you contemplate the facts, what is nature's only pre-theoretical given fact? Where does it all start? Well, it starts with mental states. That's all we have. Everything else is an abstraction of theory. It may be a correct abstraction, but it is nonetheless an abstraction of theory. The only pre-theoretical given is that there is mind, because theories are made in mind, abstractions are conceived in mind. And if you accept that, which many people don't,
Yeah, I
but
know.
I think every reasonable person will accept that. If you accept that, then the question you have to ask is, do I need to postulate the existence of anything other than mental states to accommodate the regularities of life, the irregularities of nature? If the answer is yes, then by all means, let's infer that there are such things as strictly physical states that are purely quantitative and that exist outside mind. We have no direct access to them, but we can theoretically infer that they must exist. But if it's not necessary to invent this stuff, to abstract new stuff into existence, if it's not necessary to do that, if we can account for nature without it, then it should be preferred. The only step that we need to make is the following. Because of our culture bound intuitions today, we think that if we acknowledge that there are states external to our minds, then those states are necessarily non mental. Why? If you accept that there are external states, states that are not in my mind, but they too can be mental, because my mental states are not in your mind, and you accept that my mental states exist. So if we do the same for nature at large, there is an external world. There is a world that, from our point of view, is objective, just like my thoughts from your point of view are objective. They would still be here if you're not there. If we accept that, then that is enough. That is enough to do science. That is enough to do philosophy. It is enough to account for everything that we can experience, that everything that we can measure. Then why should we postulate the flying spaghetti monster of physicalism? This physical states that are non-mental, that are exhaustively describable through a list of numbers, an abstraction, augmentation. Why do we need that? We don't need that. We can stick to mental states. So that is the jump. And if you stick to mental states, you may still want to be a reductionist like I am. I'm quite committed to reductionism, not arbitrarily, but because reductionism has worked for 400 years. And I can't
Just
help but.
explain reductionism, Bernardo.
Yeah.
Very simply.
Yeah, reductionism is the idea that most often, if not always, you can explain complex stuff in terms of simpler stuff. Many people today think of reductionism as explaining the big in terms of the small, but this is vastly out of date. This is like Democritus 2,500 years ago. That's not physics today. Physics today, the reduction basis of physics, no, the, the, the bottom level of nature is not elementary tiny subatomic particles, it's quantum fields, and quantum fields have no spatial boundaries. They span the entire universe, all of space-time. So they're not small, but they are simple, and we can explain everything that is complex in terms of simpler stuff. That is real reductionism. I am a real reductionist. I want to explain complex things in terms of simpler ones, because for the last 400 years, it has been very productive to do so. It has worked to do so. We can explain heat in terms of the movement of particles. We can explain particle interactions in terms of the interactions of quantum fields. And we can explain a body in terms of tissues or organ systems in terms of tissues in terms of cells, those in terms of molecules, atoms, elementary subatomic particles, quantum fields again. So I would like, as an idealist, to be able to reduce the complexity of nature to something that is unique, only one thing, and simple, unique and simple. Um, and we can do that if we postulate that at the basis of nature there is only one subject, and that everything else are experiences or mental states, and those mental states are patterns of excitation of the one subject. So, as a reductionist, I want to do that. And the only way to do that is to say there is only one subject in the whole of nature, and it's the subject that is looking out through your eyes, looking out through my eyes, through my cat's eyes, through the amoeba's sense mechanisms, through everything. It is the subject behind quasars and black holes and supernovae and all this stuff. It is the most reductionist, self-consistent, and explanatorily powerful metaphysical inference we can make. So I do make it.
I want to share a quick anecdote with you just to illustrate how convinced I am that the idea that an object can give rise to the subject is so absurd. So I interviewed Carlo Rovelli, and I don't know if you remember from our previous conversation, but I did not do well at physics in school. I blame my teacher. I had a user teacher, but it was the subject I did worst in. So who am I to question Carlo Rovelli, who's probably the most famous popular physics writer in the world, right? Anyway, and I proposed it, but to me, it still seems so obvious that you can't. How can you say subjectivity arises from an object, which inevitably has to be experienced by subjectivity? I challenged him on this, and we ended up sort of going around the houses a little bit. But I thought that illustrates, to me at least, I wouldn't challenge anyone on a subject I didn't feel qualified to. And many people say, who are you to have that discussion? Except for the fact it is, to me at least, and talking to you and reading your stuff and exploring this a lot, it's so obvious that even someone of that stature, I felt I had to say, come on, really? Surely. And obviously he didn't agree with me. It didn't seem anyway.
Mind can tie itself in knots. And we shouldn't underestimate that. Sometimes high intelligence is a liability, because a highly intelligent mind is even better at tying itself in knots. You can be very sophisticated at weaving a web of knots and get all entangled in that and never come out. You're lost forever in the Minotaur's labyrinth. There is no thread to pull you back anymore. That can happen. I have great respect for Carlo. I think his relational quantum mechanics, which is called a interpretation of quantum mechanics today, I don't think it's an interpretation. I think it is a direct examination of the implications of quantum mechanics. In other words, it's pretty objective. It's not a subjective interpretation. It's like you gotta acknowledge it must be true, because that quantum theory allows for distinct descriptions of the same series of events, both equally valid, although they are mutually contradictory. Quantum theory allows for that. So this is not an interpretation, it's an inventorization of the implications of quantum theory and what it means. That's Relational Quantum Mechanics by Carlo Rovelli. And I think he's correct. And the conclusion of that is that all physical entities are relational.
Yes.
There are no absolute physical stuff. It's like movement. Movement is relational, right? If I am inside a train, I'm not moving in relation to my seat, but I am moving in relation to the train station that we just left. So there is no absolute movement. If there were only one thing in the universe, it wouldn't move. It would make no sense to speak of movement, because it needs another thing in relation to which it moves. It's said to be going away or approaching that other thing, right? In the same way, Ravelli says that all physical entities are like movement. They are relational. They don't have absolute existence. I agree with that. But then comes what in my mind is a theoretical metaphysical prejudice. He also wants to say that there are only physical entities. And therefore, there is nothing that moves. What is it that moves, Carlo? Well, it's movement itself. In other words, what are the relations of? Well, it's relations between relations. Okay, but what are these meta relations then relating? Well, meta relations. And it's turtles all the way down. And once I confronted him with that, and he said, yes, it's turtles all the way down. Now, I think this means nothing. It's a theoretical construct that you can model mathematically. Goodness knows you can model that mathematically through recursion. but it means nothing. It's like saying there is only movement, but nothing that moves. What moves is also movement. Well, that means nothing. You can say that in English, you can word it, but it has no semantic anchor. It means nothing. You're saying nothing, right? It's like Lewis Carroll saying the Cheshire cat disappears, but its green stays behind. You can write that. You can get away with it as Lewis Carroll, but you can't get away with it, I think, as a modern analytic scholar. It's just, it makes no sense. Ravelli then goes back to Nagarjuna and Buddhism and try to anchor it that way. In my mind, it's like that cartoon in which somebody's making a long derivation on a blackboard and then it
Yes.
converges to a certain point, and then he says, "Here a miracle happens," and then he continues on. Well, Nagarjuna's appeal is Ravelli's "Here a miracle happens." I think the obvious answer to this, and I think any regular person, you don't need a high IQ to see this. The obvious answer to this is that all physical entities are relational because what relates is not physical. It's staring you in the face. All physical entities are like movement, but what moves is therefore not physical because what moves must be absolute. It cannot itself be movement. Movement doesn't move. Movement has no meaning unless there is something that moves in relation to something else. These things not themselves being movement. And you can solve that with mental states. If the world is mental states and physical states are dashboard representations of measurements of these mental states, then everything on the dashboard is relational. And lo and behold, it is. If there are two airplanes moving in the sky, making measurements of wind direction, for instance, those measurements will be relational with the particular airplane's perspective. For one airplane, the wind is a headwind. For the other one, it's a tailwind, depending on where the plane is going, right? So, yes, all physical entities are relational because they are measurement representations, like dashboard representations. But the thing that is measured cannot be relational. You don't need to get yourself tied up in obtruse theoretical knots and jump through hoops of abstraction to understand that that's what relational quantum mechanics means. The world that is measured, the states that are measured, are not physical, they're mental. And therefore, physical states, which are the results of measurements, represent the real world without being the real world, but they do convey important information about the world, just like an airplane's dashboard does convey important information about the sky, but it isn't the sky. Dashboard measurements are always relational, but the thing that is measured is not. It's the real world out there. That would be the idea, and you do not need the 200 IQ to grasp this.
So
You only need
people,
a 200 IQ if you want to believe that all is movement and only movement moves. Then God help you. You really need a high IQ to take yourself into that story and convince yourself, looking in the mirror, that you're holding a position that makes sense.
yeah. Okay, so there are lots of well-known mainstream people working in physics who are still materialists, so still believe that fundamentally mind is created by matter, mind is created by the brain. But I think turning to the population at large, I think I find it somewhat frustrating that people don't realize that they have consumed and inherited this belief. They don't actually realize that they have this belief. So I was at a party recently, a birthday party, and there was someone there, and I just caught them talking about religion. And they were talking about religion and explained it as, oh, humans need to have stories for how things are. And I sort of leapt on that and I said, yes, but do you realize that you have a story for how things are that is equally magical as any religious story, but you don't even know it, insofar as that out of tofu, out of physical objects, out of object comes mind, comes subjectivity. And this guy went pretty quiet. But I think that's, to come back to your book, for example, I think it's the proportion of people who don't even realize that there is this belief that is there is no evidence for, that literally is at the center of everything, of the way we live. That to me is the thing that I find quite difficult in a way to, or frustrating.
Once you see that, um, the world becomes bizarre. It's like you realize that we are living in a fake story for 400 years.
Yeah.
And it takes you aback. It's like,
Mm.
wow. And,
Yeah.
and I recognize that because I went through that. And now I'm used to it. You know, it's how it has always been. Before those 400 years, there was another story we believed in. And today we laugh at it. But for those people, it was their reality. And of course, future generations not far from now will realize how crazy we are. And but when you realize that as it's happening, and you understand that this has always been the human condition, it's almost traumatizing at first. But
I
then it
want.
becomes.
Yeah, I wonder, Bernardo, if this, how you feel about this. I sometimes find it, as it has sunk in, it almost makes me feel a little lonely sometimes, because there are very few people outside of conversations like this. And I'm very fortunate with my wife as well. She gets it in a more experiential way, perhaps in some ways. And we can touch on that. But as I said, I said to you before we started recording, I increasingly try and avoid talking about this stuff with people, but invariably it sort of slips out, and once it gets going, that's it. But it is almost a bit lonely, because as it does seep in, as the implications do dawn increasingly, and you sort of drift further away from the vast majority of people, I feel almost a bit lonely with it, at times outside of conversations like this. I don't know how you feel in that sense.
I, we are not alone. It's just that the people who see it as we do don't make much noise about it. Only a few of them find themselves in the unfortunate position of having to broadcast this, which is a position I find myself in, and I never looked for it. I never wanted it.
Mm. Mm.
Um, but yeah, at some point you realize that that's your responsibility. That's your telos in life. That's the role you are supposed to play. But I can reassure you that you're not alone.
Yeah.
We have never been alone throughout history. Uh, those of us that saw it have written about this,
Mm.
and they are there. They are there right now. Um, we exist as anatomically modern humans for about 300,000 years, give or take 50,000. Um, but there is only evidence for an intellect, for symbolic reasoning. In other words, for replacing reality with concepts and then working out those concepts in your mind and then projecting the conclusions back out into reality. There is evidence for this for only about 30 to 50,000 years, which is yesterday. Um, but despite how powerful this ability to think symbolically, to think conceptually is, it has been very useful. It allowed us to conquer the planet. Um, and listen to your heart to what I'm about to say. I don't mean it in a pejorative way. Huh? It is a form of madness because it places a conceptual blanket in between you and reality. It's a very powerful blanket because it allows you to make predictions about reality. And therefore, it allows you to figure out ways to put reality to work in your favor. Construct tools to do engineering, develop science, and all that. So it's in practice, it's a very powerful form of madness, but it is a form of madness because you sort of blanket yourself, you make yourself blind to the rawness of reality. And now you can only experience reality through the intermediation of conceptual narratives. So you're no longer relating directly to reality. You're relating to your own narratives, which are invariably crazy. They are usefully crazy, but they are invariably crazy. Let me give you some examples.
Well, can I
Um,
give you one, Bernardo?
sure,
Just quickly,
sure.
just throw back at you. I've talked about this a few times. The example I would use is nationality. So we create the idea, for example, of Britain and the Netherlands and America, which is useful, but then we act as if it's a real thing, as if to be British it means that I am actually different from you, and it's crazy, right? Like it's we live in that abstraction and conceptualization, as you say, and then also identity. You know, people talk about. I spoke to someone fairly recently who was talking about their job and what they liked about it, and they said, "And of course, it's my identity too." And I was like, "That's crazy!" Like, like what you telling me? Your job can hear what I'm saying right now. Obviously, I didn't say that, but that's what I was thinking. So that would be my examples. It's like taking, for example, a country to be real or the equator to be real rather than a useful idea.
Yeah, or money to have value.
Yeah.
Yuval Harari wrote the most popular book in recent times exactly about this: how fictions um, become important to coordinate cooperation across people who don't even know each other. And that's the power of the human mind. We create these fictions, then we believe in them, and that's what allows us to cooperate at large scales. That's Yuval Harari's first and most popular book. Of course, he didn't take it far enough. To take it far enough, and usually books that are very successful are the ones that don't take it far enough, right? If you go into philosophy of science, there is a realization that theoretical entities are just convenient fictions because they have always been so. And we know that in hindsight. For instance, when Newton proposed gravity as an invisible force that acts instantaneously at a distance, that was woo woo nonsense at the time. Right, and the French couldn't take that for 50 years. No, invisible forces acting at a distance. This is religious nonsense, right? Lo and behold, that fiction worked very well to predict the orbits of all the planets with one small exception, that was Mercury. Newton's laws of gravity didn't quite predict Mercury's orbit. We needed relativity to predict that there were small deviations there, but it was powerful enough to put a man on the moon. Right, the designers of the Apollo mission used Newton's laws of motion and gravity to put people on the moon. It was a convenient fiction that was able to predict nature's behavior well enough for us to put a man on the moon. Now, we know that there is no such invisible force acting at a distance. We know that since Einstein. This invisible force is just a theoretical entity. In other words, nature behaved as though such force existed. And that was enough to put a man on the moon. It worked in practice, but it didn't work to predict Mercury's orbit very well. So there comes Einstein, and he says, no such invisible force. That's nonsense, folks. What is really going on is that the invisible fabric of space time bends and twists. That's the new convenient fiction. And lo and behold, nature behaves as though the fabric of space time really bent and twisted, except that no, not quite. So now we have loop quantum gravity. So at these convenient fictions are just that, they are convenient. Up to a certain point, nature behaves as though they were true. But most people believe that these convenient fictions are actually what is out there. We believe in the force of gravity. We believe in the flexible fabric of space time. No, we believe in electromagnetic fields that permeate the vacuum. What is a field? Oh, it's something that oscillates, like the ocean, right? There are waves in the field. So there are waves in the electromagnetic field, like there are waves in the ocean. Something oscillates. In a vacuum, what is it that oscillates? Oh, it's virtual particles, virtual excitations of quantum fields that permeate the vacuum. Well, that theoretical fiction is very convenient. It allows us to predict particle interactions and certain basic uh, uh, quantities of nature to many points after the decimal, many places after the decimal point. But they are fictions, and that's what we miss. We miss, look, because these fictions are so powerful, it is, things work as though they were true. And therefore, we believe that they are true. And when we believe that, it works because the fictions are convenient. But the madness resides in believing that the fictions are not fictions, but reality. And that's our madness. That's the madness of a conceptual mind, a symbolic mind that replaces the world with concepts and then works out these concepts in convenient narratives and then mistakes those narratives for the world. Mistaking it works, like Newton's invisible force worked, like Einstein's invisible fabric of space-time works. The madness resides in believing this shit as if they were really true, as opposed to understanding that they are just convenient fictions. So we should not ultimately believe in them. We should take them with a grain of salt. That is the madness of a conceptual mind. And it's a madness that has an evolutionary advantage. If you believe in the nonsense, you become more successful. Believing in money allowed us to cooperate at the level of entire societies, cooperate with strangers, which chimpanzees would never do. A chimpanzee would never cooperate with an unknown person. Now, you cooperate with colleagues in your company that you've never seen before. Why? Because you all believe in certain shared convenient fictions, like a piece of paper called money has actual value. No, you can't eat it. If you burn it, it hardly gives you any warmth. You can't cover yourself with it. It has zero value. But if we all believe in convenient fictions, we can achieve great things. We can cooperate in companies. We can put a man on the moon. That's the power of it. And that's the power of the madness. Um, the only problem is that when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to understanding what is the self, what is the world, how do they relate, what is the meaning of life, what happens after we die, when it comes to the deeper questions, then it backfires. Then it's pure madness. It's no longer convenient. It's pathological madness. You see, the problem is that the madness in practice is useful. But when it comes to the deeper questions of life and existence, it is really just madness. It's pathological. It's like schizophrenia. It's like being batshit crazy. Like eliminativists and illusionists in my book are batshit crazy. Uh, um, Sophisticated high IQ crazy, because that's what it takes, to entertain those kinds of fictions. And that's our dilemma. We are by construction practically clever and philosophically mad.
What about the evolutionary idea that the conceptual mind came online, let's say, enabled us to conquer the world and to make agreements about things like countries and money, and then we're not done from an evolutionary point of view, and that recognition that perhaps right now people tend to think they are the mind, they are the concept, but actually getting that distance and realizing, oh no, you could almost say you have a mind, you're aware of the mind, and so it's a tool in that way rather than who you are. And that expanding that gap and seeing that more clearly, could that be a part of the evolutionary process?
I don't think so, because evolution for us has been hijacked by culture. Um, you are now, you're the likelihood that you will live long enough and reproduce is as modulated now by cultural dynamics, or even more modulated by cultural dynamics than by physiology. Um, and that modulation can even go the other way around. Like the more educated you are today, the more financially successful, the less likely it is that you have a lot of children. The less likely is you pass your genes on. So culture uh, brings a mass into evolution. Undoubtedly, evolution is still happening, but it's happening in a much more noisy environment now, with many more variables that have nothing to do with evolution as it was before culture. And that has also to do with language, with communication, with convenient fictions, shared belief systems, and all that stuff. So it's a very messy situation right now. All in all, I think language, although practically powerful, is the source of most of our confusion. Let me give you some simple examples. We mistake nouns for things. In the case of this bottle, this noun, bottle, seems to correspond to something in the world. But we think of this something in the world as being a thing unto itself, separate from the other things. Like the leg of a chair, it's a thing. Okay. What about the chair? Is it a thing? Yes. Well, but the leg of the chair is part of the chair. So is the leg of a chair a thing, or does it supervene on another thing? You see? And then a panpsychist would say, well, the chair is conscious. But what about the leg of the chair? Is it conscious too? And the panpsychist would have to say yes. But does it have then a separate consciousness from the chair as a whole? You see the mess, and then if you answer that, and then I'll start asking you, what about a molecule in the leg of the chair? Is that a thing? Is it then conscious too? Is there something it is like to be the molecule as opposed to the leg of the chair, as opposed to the chair? Uh, 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 we mistake nouns for things. The answer to all this is there are no chairs. There are no legs of chairs. There are no molecules. It's like trying to find the boundary between the river and the ocean. We establish these divisions by convenience. I need to refer to something to be able to buy a car and move around. So we create a name for car. Is the car a thing? No, not by any criteria. I mean, let's take the functioning of the car, the ability to move. Can I put the boundary of the car around what is needed for the car to move? Like I need the spark plugs, so it's part of the car. I need the tires, so it's part of the car. But the road is not part of the car. No, wait a moment. If there is no road for the tires to grip, you don't move. If there is no air to facilitate combustion, oxygen to allow combustion and to cool the engine, you don't move. If there is no gravity that pulls the tires to the road, so there is grip, the car doesn't move. So you can go on and go on and on and on and on until you realize that only the universe can be the car. And the same for everything else. Only the universe can be the table. Because the table is made of wood. Wood came from trees. Trees only grew because there is light from the sun. The sun only formed because there was the Big Bang and the quantum fluctuations in the early universe. And if you go into entanglement, then everything, there's only one thing, it's the universe. So language language misleads us into projecting the structure of language onto the structure of existence. There are only nouns, there are no objects. Here, a more extreme example. Here, this is a fist, it's a thing. Boom, where is the thing? Did it just disappear and violated the principle of conservation of energy? No, there is no fist. There was never a fist. That's why if I open my hands, there is no fist. Not because the fist disappeared, but because there was never a fist to begin with. We mistake nouns for things. Um,
Can I
we
can I just
mistake.
jump in quickly, Bernardo? And I just want to see if I was right then, because I'm reminded of my conversation with Carlo Rovelli, and I can't. It's somewhat vague, and I'd have to dig it out. But at one point, he said he held up a pen and said, "So he's telling me there is this pen kind of has no standalone existence." And my reply, if I remember rightly, was, "You can't separate it from the awareness that knows it." Now, is that correct? And what you're saying there, basically?
I don't think a pen is a thing. That's the argument
Yes.
I'm trying to make.
Yes,
We
that's what
mistake.
also. Yes, yes.
Yeah,
It is that the excitation of awareness is what you mean.
correct. Not your awareness. I
No.
think there is an excitation out there that does not depend on you and which appears to you as the pen. But that excitation is not a thing unto itself. There is no pen. There is just the inanimate universe as a whole. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yes.
But because we mistake the structure of language for the structure of reality, we we fall into all kinds of traps, conceptual traps that have no bearing to reality. It's only our own madness feeding itself. And then you get eliminativism, illusionism, and Rovelli appealing to Nagarjuna to justify why everything that exists are physical entities, but all physical entities are relative. It's like saying there is only movement, but nothing that moves. I mean, God help you with that. That's what we get into when we mistake the structure of language, the structure of our conceptual reasoning, for the structure of reality. So my answer to you would be there is something out there that does appear to you as a pen, but also as the rest of the universe. So the pen is not a thing. It's like looking at a digital photo and saying all the yellow pixels are one thing. No, the yellow pixels are part of the one unitary holistic image. You carve out boundaries across groups of pixels only nominally, in other words, by convenience. So that's why we carve out a boundary and we say there is a pen, because if you need to ask for one, you need a handle for that. You need a way to communicate your need or your want, right? So we created these artificial boundaries based on convenience, but then we proceed and mistake them for the actual structure of the world. And then we tie ourselves in knots. We are mad. And that's the realization, going back to that loneliness, Simon. Um, it is a sobering realization to understand that culture is fundamentally a form of madness. To understand that both we are batshit crazy, and it's because of that that we conquered the world.
Huh.
This is the sobering realization. It can also be that because of that, we are going to exterminate ourselves. We're very, very close to that. We have never been closer to that than right now. So that is even more sobering. But to step back and take account not only of our craziness, but of the evolutionary necessity of this craziness. That is sobering because, on the one hand, you want to do more or less what I do, which is to say to the crazy people, you're all batshit crazy. You're coming across as this, you know, erudite scholars who know better, but no, you're just tying yourselves in knots. On the one hand, to feel the need to do that, and on the other hand, to sympathize and empathize with that, and to know that ultimately that's also my destiny. That even though I may have seen some things that extrapolate the average craziness, I am batshit crazy when it comes to other things. And of course, I cannot point out to you what they are, because otherwise I would have seen through them. But it's a statistical certainty for me that I am batshit crazy about a great many things. And this realization is very sobering.
Yeah. Wow.
To understand that I can be as crazy as Ravelli when it comes to other things.
But there
And
is
that
but there is no more important thing though, really, in my view, than what we're talking about here, right? Which is that there is only one thing, as you say, right? And it is not a thing, it's mind. And it's not someone's mind, it's just mind. It's impersonal. And then we are boundaried minds within that, because everything flows from that. You know, sometimes I would say, obviously, we see everything that's going on with politics, and you've got the left and the right, and both sides think the other's crazy. And my view is that it's all shifting deck chairs on the Titanic when this materialist paradigm that we are separate, it's dog eat dog, it's survival of the fittest, we're not connected, then, whatever system is in place, it's going to fall apart until that fundamental belief is exposed and seen through. And you talk about this at the end of the book, right? You say that we have a responsibility to speak up, and help, let's say, with the pivot, not from an egotistical point of view, but, and you said yourself earlier, you said that you had no plan to end up where you are now. Well, I certainly would not have predicted having a conversation like this 10 years ago. I was a huge fan of Christopher Hitchens. And, I was a strident atheist. And, and that's not saying anyway I'm religious, because I'm not at all. But at the same time, here I am. I would have to describe myself as very deeply spiritually inclined now, which I never would have predicted. But you talk about this um, this responsibility for people who see what we're talking about here to kind of make a stand, because it's more important than our own individual reputations and everything like that.
Yeah, because otherwise we all feel like islands. We don't get any kind of social validation when we see through things. It's like you said in the beginning. It feels very lonely because it's like everybody around us does not share that insight. So because of that, I think it is our responsibility when we see through the craziness, at least part of it, that we raise our hands and say, I see through it. Do you see too? If you do, I am with you. You are not alone. That's why I think it's very important for us to do that, because it provides the comfort we get through a degree of social validation. And humans are social animals. We do require some degree of social validation, so we don't end up concluding the reverse of reality, which is that we are crazy and everybody else is somehow reasonable, even though this never happened in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
It was never the case, but
Yeah.
we may still think it is the case now. No, it is not, and that social validation, I think, is very important. That's the call to arms at the end of the book. It's if you understand this and you see this, one could argue it is your moral responsibility to raise your hand and become a beacon that others can see and realize that they too are not alone.
And then do you think that could lead to a tipping point in terms of the pivot? Could you envisage a time when, a, a decisive mass of people, crossed over the 50% barrier or whatever in the future, and what we're
It's
talking about here is
inevitable.
mainstream? It's inevitable.
Yeah, it's happening. I mean, I wish I could share more. I mean, there are it, it, you need honest people to do that. It's- it- People who are committed to truth and not to their own self-image, or their own facade and imago. And fortunately, many scientists and many philosophers have that kind of that honesty, that kind of commitment to truth above self-image, or imago. One example of that is Christoph Koch, who 20 years ago would have come across to you as an inveterate materialist, and who is on record today on pages 2 and 3 of his latest book, And Then I Am Myself, the World. That's the title of his book, came out this year, in which he says, consciousness is primary. Everything else is theoretical abstraction, or something to that effect. Um, he has the, the scientific integrity and, frankly, the moral self confidence that is required to continue to peel the onion of truth into his he's now 67 years old, into his 68th year. Not many people do that. Many people, when they cross into their 50s, they don't want to change their minds anymore. It's too much work. It's too much energy. It feels like you're coming close to the end. You have to settle down. But people who are profoundly intellectually honest, like Christoph, they cannot do that, because that's dishonest towards truth. You have to be honest to what you're learning, to the evolution of your understanding of reality. And there are many others like Christoph, who didn't write it in their books, were not giving podcast interviews, and I know a subset of them.
Yeah.
And I can't talk about it like I couldn't talk about Christoph until his book came out. But I can tell you there is a profound shift happening, and it's not like it's a new process. We are always shifting.
Sure.
It's just that our lives are so short that we don't get to see that unless we have the luck to live in that transition moment when a shift that has always been happening becomes visible,
Yeah.
more discernible amongst the noise. But it's a virtual certainty that if I live to my average life expectancy as a Dutch male, which would be 82 years old, well, right now my life expectancy is higher than that because I already lived to 50, right? So if I live to that, uh, which I don't really need to, but if it happens, if I live to that, I'm quite confident the shift will have happened. It will be in my lifetime
Wow.
because it is happening.
That's so interesting. Um, I mentioned loneliness earlier, and we've touched on it a couple of times. And I suppose there are two sides to that, in that the people in my life, my wife besides, I can't talk to them about this stuff, right? But since I started talking about it on the podcast, it has been like, let's say, a boat at sea at night, and then it puts the light on, and everything is drawn towards that. And people have come out of the woodwork, and I've made connections, and it's been a real pleasure. And in terms of the responsibility you speak of, I touched on this when I sent you an email, in that I thought, okay, where do I fit into all this, right? In my own very small little way. And just to give a bit of background, I went and I did ayahuasca in 2015 in the Netherlands, actually, with the Santa Daima Church. And I had this very overwhelming two experiences. One very overwhelming non-dual experience, and I woke up hours later rocking, going, "It's so big, it's so big." And then the next day, you can experience yourself as in sort of different times and doing different things and stuff. So I experienced myself as a French philosopher in Paris, smoking cigarettes in a cafe in Paris. And I was utterly distraught because I was like, oh my God, like this is what I care about, right? Reality, so on and so forth. But here I am, I later thought this time, I'm a sports reporter. What could be further from what I do is so meaningless. I can't believe it. I was in utter despair. And this was before a major sporting tournament that I was going to cover like a week or two later. So the timing of this ayahuasca experience was pretty, pretty poor. And then over time, I started my podcast and various things happened. And I realized actually that why I had been interested in sport, and in my case, tennis the whole time anyway, had actually been for reasons other than the cultural given ones about winning and et cetera, et cetera. And that people started talking, for example, about flow. And obviously, the beauty of flow is you lose yourself. That sense of self, the egoic sense of self, the conceptual self, like disappears, and it comes as a bloody relief. And then I spoke to Rupert, and then that led to various things. And so I feel like it's like I come at it from this bizarre, like sporting and scientifically pretty illiterate point of view. But like you say, I feel this compulsion, and as you put it so beautifully in the book, this responsibility to talk about it because it is that important. Like yeah. Does that make sense? I don't know what you make of that story.
I understand you. I have a different view of sports. I think sports are an enactment, a symbolic enactment of profound pre-linguistic archetypal truths. Just like war is, but we better do sports, if you know what I mean. Just like the gladiators were in Rome, but we better do MMA. And I think this symbolic, constant reenactment of these archetypal truths are very important for our sanity. Otherwise, we are completely lost in language, completely lost in concepts. And
Mm.
sports have been holding the torch of type of truth that is not amenable to linguistic representation since the first Olympics in Greece. And we will always enact those archetypal realities. If there are no sports, we will enact them in a much worse, dangerous, destructive way, like we have, sure enough, right? So I don't see your sports career as so distinct from what you feel you should do now.
Oh no, I
Uh,
don't. I've come to realize at that moment that I was taking ayahuasca, I was like, oh, it's so far apart. But over time, since then, I see it now as this window into what we're talking about from a quite um, a quite unexpected vantage point, as in coming at it initially through sport. I mean, it's really broadened from that. And I know what you're saying about those, let's say, the culture, the archetypes, or however you described it. But also there is that flow
They're not
aspect.
cultural. They are deeper than
Oh,
culture.
sorry,
They
yeah,
are
yeah, of course,
human
yeah,
archetypes.
yeah, human archetypes, right? But there is also that flow aspect, like of watching, for me, my favorite thing, watching Federer in full flow, right? And knowing that is the universe doing something quite special and miraculous, a bit like Mozart playing music, right? That is a deeply spiritual experience. And it's only now that I can realize that I put the two
Ah,
together, you see? Whereas at the time when I had this trip, I was like, oh my God, sport is meaningless. The philosophy of reality is where it's at. And then I realized actually they're not two separate things. It's just
they
a
are
different
not.
way of seeing it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I'm totally with you there. And I'm glad you have seen it. Otherwise, it would have been a pity
yeah.
to miss this.
And then also I think, as I said to you, I worked in youth programming. And so we were taught to really try and, I don't know how well I still do it, but explain things in simple terms. And I have to do that for myself anyway, because otherwise I don't understand stuff. As I said, I did not do well in physics at school. And so, yeah, anyway, listen, I'm sort of going a bit off on my
No,
own
no.
tangent here.
If I can follow you on on that tangent, Schopenhauer wrote that the closest thing to a direct apprehension of the will, to mind at large, he used the word will, the closest thing we could experience to the archetypal ebb and flow of the will was music, because music has a certain rhythm, has a certain structure. You know when music is pleasing and when sounds are just dissonant, and we can't tell why one is pleasing and the other one is dissonant. Well, the reason is one reflects the archetypal ebb and flow of mind, which is the foundation of nature, and the other one doesn't, and it feels dissonant. um, that notion of a sort of inherent rhythmic structure into the world at large that we can relate to in music, but not in the world at large. You can approach perceiving the world musically, perceiving the rhyme and rhythm with which the world moves. You can approach that if you start from music, but you start seeing the same rhyme and rhythm in a soccer match, because some soccer matches are beautiful,
Yes.
others are not,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There is music in a soccer match.
Yes.
And although I don't have Brazilian nationality, I grew up there. I have my youth there. So I don't know whether it's because of that, because the Dutch are very much into football as well, in soccer. But I credit Brazil with having developed my sensitivity for the beauty of a soccer match. I see the same ebb and flow in certain MMA fights, which is like 3D chess with zero point 0.1 second per move, right? It's like one of the greatest intellectual activities human beings could engage in. And these guys are not given credit for that. So, but yes, I mean, these are geniuses. And you can see that the rhythm, the structure of the movement in that archetypal contest that you have in a good, expert level MMA fight. Um, Once you develop that from music into sports, you stand a much better chance in discerning that in life,
Yes. Yes.
all aspects of life.
Yes.
And then you are a step further towards becoming less crazy.
Yes. Very. Yes. I completely agree with you about Brazil. I actually grew up with a VHS, The Boys from Brazil, I think it was, which was each of their World Cup campaigns. So that goal in 1970 and Rivellino and Zico and everything. And that is why, just to go off on a bit of another sport tangent, like Federer for me is the guy, right? And people have these arguments about greatest, and fun enough, people talk about it, tends that, well, you have to decide greatest in terms of quantities, right? How many
Yeah.
titles? But actually, for me, it's like, no, it's qualities. Listen, you can't completely dismiss the quantities, of course, but there's a very famous article that someone wrote, Roger Federer as religious experience. I can't remember the name of the author, but and that to me is when he was in full flow. That's what it was. It was religious experience. It was spiritual experience, just in the same way as watching Brazil play football, or or MMA, as you just said. It is.
Yeah,
It's a window into this.
yeah, it is preconceptual, it's archetypal, it's the reality behind the madness. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on from sport. So, listen, could you just explain, as you do so brilliantly in the book, briefly, relatively briefly, a bit about the history? Because I think this is very important in terms of the history of the church and science, and basically how materialism emerged really as a way for scientists to avoid being burnt at the stake.
That's how it began, and we have the records to show. Because science, when it began, it metaphysics was not the big game for science. Science wanted to understand the regularities of nature, how the world behaves, not what the world is. That's why Galileo dropped the two balls from the top of the Tower of Pisa. He wanted to see whether one ball would arrive first on the ground or not. It's what nature does, not what nature is. But the church had supremacy over the whole continent of Europe for 1,000 years, right? From the fall of Rome to the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century or 15th century, I should say. Um, so that absolute power. Look, the church was the most powerful institution in the world, and it had no army except for the Templars, but then it got rid of its own army and killed its own small army at some point. So you only get to do that, to be the most powerful institution in the world without an army, when you control belief systems, which the church did. And that was the threat that science offered to the church. It offered the possibility of engaging with the world in a different way, through a different set of values, and therefore undermining the belief system that made the church powerful without an army. It's a tremendous threat. It's a bigger threat than to mobilize a whole army against the church, right? And it was perceived as such. So the church would not hesitate in burning a scientist at the stake, like they did with Bruno in 1600, because Bruno realized that the other stars were suns, and therefore we were not in the center of the universe. It was an isotropic universe extending infinitely in every direction. That undermined the belief system that maintained the church as the most powerful institution, and it was intolerable. So Bruno would not recant. It would have been better for the church if he would have recanted, because it would then reaffirm the church's power structure. He didn't, so they burned him alive at the stake in a square in Rome in the year 1600. Not one scientist has missed that. Everybody took notice that that's what could happen. So it was important to carve out a domain for science that the church wouldn't perceive as threatening. And the way to do that was to say the church owns spirit. And the church owns psyche, which is the Greek word that we translate into sometimes soul, but certainly spirit and mind. All these words are translations from the Greek psyche. So the church had domain over the psyche, the world of spirit, the world of souls, the world of mind. But scientists invented this other metaphysical domain, starting from Descartes, which were supposed, whatever it was supposed to be non-psyche. That was the key criterion. Whatever it was not psyche. So we are not threats to the church. Please don't burn us at the stake. And as late as the 18th century, Denis Diderot, one of the two authors of La Encyclopédie, which is the founding document of the Enlightenment, which sort of succeeded the Renaissance. He's on record saying, we know materialism doesn't work. Probably everything is just instinct with life. There is no matter as such. Um, but we still have to use it as a weapon against the church. And he's on record saying this. So the early Enlightenment figures, they knew that the whole metaphysical story around physicalism was a political tool, even a survival tool. And as the Industrial Revolution kicked in, as the bourgeoisie started becoming a very influential class, vying for dominance against the clergy, what was initially a political tool of survival became a tool of domination. You know, from the July Revolution of 1830 onwards, it was not enough to have a dualistic belief, like the type of belief that even the great Goethe had. In his autobiography, he says that you got to something to the effect. Or I'm paraphrasing him now. He says you got to be mad not to understand that matter and mind are the two essential components of nature. So that's the dualistic belief that Descartes started to carve out a corner for science to do its thing without being burned at the stake. But from the July Revolution on, the game was to go beyond that and to say, oh, by the way, mind arises from matter. So matter is more fundamental. And the political game there is the bourgeoisie carry more cachet than the clergy. Because the bourgeoisie, you know, they are the people behind the mechanisms of the Industrial Revolution, you know, steam engines, you know, power tools, and all that stuff. And that's material stuff. If you could say that mind is derivative from matter, then who rules the rooster? It's the bourgeoisie, right? And at some point after the middle of the 19th century, we started actually believing the snake oil. We started believing the bullshit, you know, because with Darwin, the church was robbed of its last bastion, which is the explanation for the origin of life. God designed us. And then Darwin came around and said, no, we evolved. And all of that played out as a mechanism. And the mechanism idea is sufficient. Then we started actually believing that. There were the reasons, psychological reasons for that as well. If you think that mind is a product of ephemeral arrangements of matter, then when you die, your ability to suffer ends and all of your problems come to an end. And you get rid of the single greatest fear humankind has always had, which is the fear of what we will experience after we are dead, the fear of the great unknown. And it's the fear that allowed the church to be the dominant political institution for 1,000 years without an army. It is that fear, because they would convince you that they could make sure that your experience after death would be tolerable. They would even sell you real estate in the sky after death, right? The indulgences. Um, so to get rid of the single greatest fear our species has had over its existence, 300,000 years, is just about the greatest psychological, you know, benefit you could get from believing in materialism. We don't relate to that now because we take it entirely for granted. You know, so we can't relate to the advantage, the psychological advantage of that move anymore. We take it for granted now. But at the time, it was a fantastic move. It was a great relief to actually believe your political story, to drink your own snake oil. And Nietzsche was the only one who realized this. And the only one who realized the price we would pay later for this, which was nihilism. It's the end of meaning. You know, your fear of death is gone. You're not going to suffer in hell afterwards. You don't need to fear that. You know, you don't need the church anymore. You don't. No, you are not going to go to hell. There is no hell. There will be nobody there to experience anything. Um, so the advantage was obvious, but we didn't see it then, except for phenomenal people like Nietzsche, who saw it 100 years before everybody else. The price we would pay is nihilism. It's the absolute lack of meaning. You know, you don't fear hell anymore. Now you fear life because it's vacuous, pointless. And Nietzsche described it as the destiny of the last man, the letzte Mensch.
Yeah.
The last humans would be the correct translation. and that is our destiny. We are the last humans, and therefore we now have the psychological motivation to review what happened and try to figure out exactly what happened. And materialism was at first a political tool, and later a form of what psychologists call meaning compensation. Sorry, fluid compensation, which is when you lose one source of meaning, you precariously try to replace that with another one. And we lost one source of meaning. We lost transcendent meaning, the meaning of life itself, when we rejected mind as a fundamental part of reality, because meaning resides in mind. If you reject mind as fundamental, you reject meaning as fundamental, and the only alternative is nihilism. So when we lost that source of meaning, we fluidly compensated with other made up sources of meaning. One of them, this is psychology 101, and this is not my invention. One of them is closure. Like, even if you lost all meaning, at least you understand what's going on and you get one up on the universe by understanding.
Yeah.
And you see, it's like it's all crap, it's all nihilistic, it's all a piece of crap, but at least I understand it. I get one up on the cruelty of nature by understanding how it works.
Yes.
And that's science right there, right? The need for closure. That's why we put in billions in the Large Hadron Collider, where I had the honor to work as the first crew to, back in 96, after the project was approved in 94. I was at CERN and the first team of designers of the Large Hadron Collider. We put in billions in that stuff. Why? Does it have any practical application now or in the foreseeable future? No, it doesn't. It's purely for closure. We want to get one up on this cruel, nihilistic nature that has no meaning. Another form of fluid compensation um, is ego differentiation. We like to see ourselves as somehow superior, because if there is no superior God, then only the Ubermensch will do. Nietzsche saw that too. Nietzsche saw that God was dead, and the only alternative was to transcend our own humanity.
Yeah.
And this kind of distinction is something that motivates scientists too. They are above, the man on the street, in the sense that they understand things. So
Yes.
we applied all that, but fluid compensation ultimately comes to an end. You cannot play this self-deceiving game forever. At some point, you have to pay the bill. You can't stay in the restaurant anymore, and it's now the bill's coming.
Yeah. Okay. So that explanation around scientists wanting to avoid being burnt at the stake is how it started, and then we started believing the own lie, as it were. And then you spoke then about the nihilism, and I found this really interesting in the book. This, okay, how does culture keep the momentum going, or there is a momentum to this materialist belief, and part of that is that superiority that comes from saying, I am big enough and brave enough to acknowledge that life has no meaning. And there is a superiority baked into that, isn't there?
Of
I think
course,
I
it's
think of someone like Ricky Gervais, right? Like, he makes I love him in The Office. Don't give him David Brent, best character of all time in my view. But when he comes on and he talks about it in terms of this bravery of realizing that life is meaningless and that's it,
yeah.
and it's applauded, like, wow, as whereas what we're talking about is seen as childish, fantasy that's we're just trying to console ourselves.
Of course, the only way for meaning, for fluid compensation to work through ego differentiation, is to put other people down. Because we are not Superman, and deep inside we know we are not. So you have to put other people down, since you can't elevate yourself that much. And neo atheism is the energy behind it is fluid compensation. It's the need to say that, as Alan Watts put it, we are the tough guys who stare the difficult facts in the face, and therefore we are better than those gullible believers who entertain their fantasies. It doesn't matter that what you're peddling is total horse shit. It's a completely inconsistent, empirically inadequate, explanatorily poor story it differentiates you as one of the tough guys who stares the difficult facts in the face. It's not about rationality. It's not about reason. It's not about empirical evidence. It's about ego differentiation. That's fluid compensation one on one.
Yeah. And you talk about power structures and the risk to reputation, for example. And I found the whole bit around psychedelics really interesting. So, as I mentioned, I did ayahuasca in 2015 and again in 2016. Well, I mean, goodness me, easily the most terrifying and transformative experience of my life. And then, so you point out in the book that the research clearly shows that when we take a psychedelic like ayahuasca or psilocybin, and the experience is so insanely overwhelming compared to our normal consciousness, you could say, it's not that brain activity is going up, it's clearly going down. So that's just first thing to state. But I found it disappointing when you pointed out the way it's been reported. I think you said it was CNN, and then there's Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial London. You know, a lot of people seem to have knowingly said that the opposite was the case.
I don't believe it was malicious from the beginning. No, I think it originated as a sincere misunderstanding of one's own study. The person in question was not the first author of the study, but is the person the media talks to. So I think the origin of it was a sincere misunderstanding. Um, the lack of action to correct this misunderstanding is a different story. I reserve judgment there. I'll stick to the facts. The facts are that things were many times vastly misreported, to the extent that what mainstream media eventually reported, like The Guardian, CNN, was the very opposite of what the studies found. And it's also an objective fact that, for instance, the scientific pictures from the study that mainstream media reproduced, they reproduced without the legend that explains what is in the picture. Now, who removed that? Was it mainstream media? Was it Imperial College when they provided the materials? Was it done in the interest of simplifying things to the point that it's so simplified that the opposite was reported? Is it a reflection of sincere metaphysical prejudice and bias? Is it a reflection of confirmation bias? In other words, you see what you expect to see, even if what you're staring at is the opposite of that. I think all of this plays a role. I cannot say that any of it was malicious because I don't know. What I can say, and I list in the book all the instances of it, and it's not only psychedelics, it's also memory research. A lot of what you see in mainstream media covering scientific results is flat out wrong, and in more than one occasion, the opposite of what the studies actually found. And I personally do not see any great effort on the part of scientific institutions or scientists to correct these errors, which, in my opinion, it is their moral responsibility to do. Even if the original error came from them and it wasn't malicious, even then, I think they do carry the moral responsibility to do everything they can to correct that. And if they are not making that effort, if they are making no effort at all, I think that is morally censurable. I think this is not how science should be done or communicated. That's my opinion.
And just to clarify for anyone who this is new to, so when you take a psychedelic, or well, let's stick with psychedelics for the moment. When you take a psychedelic, your brain activity, what's going on in your brain goes down, but what we experience goes up just so much to be. I mean, that alone makes no sense from that point of view. Just to be clear.
Yeah, they would say otherwise because they did detect minute increases in synchronization across different brain areas. In other words, brain activity goes down, but whatever brain activity is left is more synchronized across different brain areas. So you have uh, more coupling.
But it's a tiny amount, though, right? Like tiny, tiny amount.
Oh, coupling is not that tiny.
Oh, okay.
But that was an explanation that eventually, well, this is my opinion now. It seems to have lost thrust. It seems to have been more or less abandoned as a physicalist account of the psychedelic experience in favor of another hypothesis called the entropic brain hypothesis. And there, what they say is again very different. There have been many hypotheses postulated. The entropic brain hypothesis is that yes, activity goes down, but the activity that remains um, it's more random entropy, higher entropy. Therefore, the name entropic brain hypothesis. And how do they get plausibility for this? The first thing to note is that the increase is minute and doesn't occur in every case. There is a statistic increase, but in some cases, the subject has less random brain activity and still has the full psychedelic experience. So how do you account for that, right? But statistically, there is a tiny increase. It's minute, but the plausibility they get for it is based on the word information, because according to Shannon's definition of information in his famous 1948 paper that started information theory, information as defined as being directly proportional to randomness. In other words, the more random a message is, the more information it contains. And therefore, if there is less brain activity, but the brain activity that remains is more random, then it has more information. And that accounts for the psychedelic experience. Now, this is a linguistic game. It's entirely dependent on a technical definition of information. In the case of Shannon, what he was trying to determine is he was an engineer, and the application is communications engineering here. So how do you communicate a digital message from point A to point B through a channel? And how do you design that channel? Now, the bandwidth of that channel, the minimum bandwidth, the minimum amount of information per second that that channel must be able to transmit is determined by the amount of information in a message. Now, messages can be compressed, right? If you have a picture, you can compress that picture. That's what JPEGs are. And you compress, so you transmit a smaller message, and then you uncompress on the other side, so your channel can have lower bandwidth, can be a smaller channel, less thick, so to say. But random messages are not compressible because there are no patterns here to recognize and therefore compress. No patterns that the other side already knows in advance, so it could decompress on the other side. You can't compress TV noise. No, like on the old television free to air when BBC stopped transmitting at 1 in the morning, then you would just get, static,
Yeah.
TV static. You can't compress static because there are no recognizable patterns. So in that technical sense, static has more information than your sports show, right? In that technical definition. But in the colloquial definition of information, your sports show has information and TV static has nothing because it means nothing. In the colloquial definition, information has to do with recognized meaning. In your sports TV show, although it can be compressed and transmitted through a lower bandwidth channel, it has much more information. That's the sense in which we understand information. That's the sense in which we say a psychedelic trip has a lot of information because it has a lot of recognized patterns. But it's the opposite of the word information as used under the entropic brain hypothesis. They are using Shannon's definition. In other words, your brain becomes TV static, and that's supposed to account for all the colloquial information of your psychedelic trip. That's a linguistic game of bait and switch. It's using a word that only appeals to you because of your colloquial understanding of the word, but that colloquial understanding is the opposite of the technical understanding that is actually justified in the context of the hypothesis. It's bait and switch. It's a completely senseless hypothesis. A psychedelic trip is not uncompressible TV static, all right? It has a lot of recognized patterns that convey meaning. That's why we say that a psychedelic trip is rich and intense. You cannot account for that by saying that TV static level in your brain increases a piece and tiny little amount. It's totally implausible. but they get away with it because you see the word information increases. Oh yeah, okay, then this may make sense. It's a language cop out.
Yeah,
It's it's
I see.
thoroughly misleading, even though strictly speaking it is technically accurate.
I see. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then just in terms of some other effects on the brain and then people's subjective experience, um, pilots on G-force you mentioned, and then as well the people who have damage to their brain. I looked up the acquired savant syndrome.
Yeah.
So yeah, could you just explain that, because that's pretty funky?
Yeah, okay, so under physicalism, um, all of your cognition is generated by brain function. So an impairment of brain function should always correlate with impaired cognition. That's not what we see in practice. There are a number of cases in which impaired brain function correlate with richer, intenser experience and higher cognition. Not all the time. These are non-ordinary cases. Most of the times, this correlation exists: less brain function, less cognition. But for physicalism, that should apply 100% of the times. Under analytic idealism, that should apply most of the times, but not always. And we can get into the discussion of why. But it so happens that there are many cases in which the opposite correlation happens. So there are many cases in the literature of people who were just ordinary people and then they suffered brain injury because of bullet wounds to the head, or they were stricken by lightning, or even the advance of dementia, or they had how do you call that, um, when a blood vessel in your brain
Or
bursts,
stroke?
a stroke, you have a stroke, or trauma, a car accident. There is one case in which somebody was struck by a baseball to the head. In some of those cases, some types of injury in some areas of the brain, or injury that happened because of a collateral damage during brain surgery, um, some locations of the injury, some types of injury correlate with higher cognition. So you have people, the acquired savant cases, and there was a guy who was struck in the head, suffered physical trauma to the head, and since that day, he can remember everything. He can tell you what the weather was at a particular date 20 years early and what happened that day. And then he cannot help it. He just remembers everything. There's another case in which an ordinary office worker became a prolific composer. He could just play the piano and compose clever pieces. There are other cases in which you become prodigious at math. You can perform mathematical computations in a blink, and not through explicit steps. So they can't even tell you what they are doing in their heads. They just know the answers. Um, there are less spectacular cases, not acquired savant, but for instance, there's a study in Neuron in 2010. People were studied before and after brain surgery for the removal of tumors. And when you remove a tumor, you always cause a little bit of collateral damage around where the tumor was. And people were studied, they were scored for an index of so-called self-transcendence, how much they identified with their own personal minds, and how much they identified instead with parts of the world at large. And there was a clear statistically relevant delta in the sense of self-transcendence after surgery, when when the collateral damage happened in specific areas of the brain, here in the gyrus and in specific areas of the brain. So your self-transcendence increases. In other words, your sense of self becomes larger, enriched, even though your brain function is now impaired. Mediums, the same thing.
Mm.
Mediums worse. I reserve judgment about this whole mediumship story, but there was an objective study done in 2013 in which mediums who claimed to write text that came from some transcendent source, they were studied and they had a control group and they measured their brain activities in areas related with language processing, because that's what you use when you're writing text, right? And in the control group, when they were writing text, of course, all the language processing areas lit up, became more active. In the mediums, they went to sleep, they became less active. And then they could objectively score the complexity of the text written by both groups. You can use a program to score text complexity, and the text produced by the mediums with less brain activity scored higher in complexity than the text produced by the controls. So that's not psychedelics; it's just trance state. And pilots, when they go
Bernardo,
G-force
before you get
training.
onto pilots, I just want to, you provoked something in my mind. I just want to ask you something. So I mentioned my wife earlier, and since our first date, I'd have a couple of glasses of wine, I remember, and inevitably I started talking about non-duality and this stuff. And I sort of tell a joke that on our first date, I'd started going off on the nature of reality, and she stopped me and said, "I only asked you if you had any brothers or sisters." And at that point, I realized that she was the woman I was going to marry. Anyway, so she's had to put up with me talk about this from day one. And um, at some point, not that long ago, in fact, she used to vibrate in bed, or she would feel like she was vibrating in bed, and she would whack me, say, "Can you stop shaking the bed?" And I said, I'm not doing anything, right? And then actually, I met someone at work who I connected with because we both listened to an Alan Watts montage that we used, and we both were the only people who knew who he was, and we connect, and immediately our background interests suddenly were thrust into the foreground. So we chatted, and I told her about this experience with my wife, and she said, "Oh, she's been called to astral project." So fast forward, and another time, my wife is again vibrating in bed, but rather than hit me this time, I had told her she's been called, if you like, to astral project, and rather than resist it, lean into it. So she did do this, and she says, and I absolutely believe her, she left her body, so to speak, and in an instant was everything, and was like, "Of course, this has always been the case. There was no fear, there was no nothing." And also, and this is what Simon's been going on about. So how, which is obviously I'm very jealous because I haven't had that. But so how would an experience like that, and I fully appreciate you again might want to reserve judgment, and she's had it, does it lots now. She's also a Reiki master and has done some pretty cool stuff with me. So, but how would things like that fit into this, or would you reserve judgment again?
I would reserve judgment against the words astral projection because it has all kind of connotations and denotations that I don't have an account for, and I'm not sure I want to endorse. But the phenomenology, the experience you describe, surely is very naturally accounted for under analytic idealism. So under analytic idealism, there is only one field of subjectivity. It's the subject looking out from your eyes, my eyes. It's the same subject with different narratives, different life stories, but it's the same subject, the same experiencer. And what we call matter is simply how external mental processes appear in our own dashboard. It's how we represent in our minds external mental processes, which of course raises the question, why is there this separation between internal and external? If it's all one mind, what is that? What is that separation? Well, in psychiatry, there is this phenomenon we may not necessarily understand it very well, but we empirically have known it for a long time. It's called dissociation. It's when what is essentially one mind seems to break up into seemingly disjoint centers of awareness. It used to be called multiple personality disorder in extreme cases. It's now called the dissociative identity disorder. But we all undergo non pathological forms of dissociation. When you're dreaming, you are dissociated from yourself. You think you are your dream avatar, but not the rest of the dream. Well, lo and behold, you are doing the whole thing,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But during the dream, you are dissociated. When we wake up, the dissociation ends, your dream avatar is dead, and you remember that it was you doing the whole thing. Or when we forget something that we later can remember, that's a dissociative state as well. Cognitive dissonance is a dissociative state. So dissociation is it's the currency of mind together with association. They are the two sides of the same coin, the basic process of mentation, association and dissociation. Under analytic idealism, this separation between self and external world is a dissociative boundary, which is, again, the primary currency of mind. If nature is a mind, of course, something like this was bound to happen. And it did. We call it abiogenesis, the rise of life from non life. So it is a dissociative boundary that gives us this deluded sense of a personal self distinct from the world. Now, if dissociation is a process, in other words, it's a doing of nature. We are not things; we are doings. Nature is doing a dissociation that we call ourselves. We don't exist as separate entities. It's just the illusion part of the dissociation, which is a very natural illusion to have if you are dissociated. Um, we are doings of nature, and no doing of nature, no process in nature is absolutely perfect, right? When it stops raining, the sun doesn't dry the ground completely and immediately. That's not how it happens. When something is burning, not everything that is combustible actually burns. No process in nature is like binary, foolproof, perfect. So why would dissociation be? Our dissociation boundary, our dissociative boundary, is liable to some flexibility, to some give, um, um, because why would it be differently, right? That's it's fully expectable. So it's conceivable that there are certain states of mind and some people with perhaps a genetic predisposition in which the dissociative boundary is more permeable, more porous, more flexible, amenable to giving, amenable to stretching. And when the dissociation then reduces because the boundary is being stretched or made more porous, more permeable, you experience your original identity, the only true identity, which is the field itself, and it's the whole thing. You are the subject behind everybody's eyes, and just like when you wake up from a dream, it's not like a discovery. You discovered that you were the whole dream. No, you remembered
Yes.
that, it's a remembrance. So when dissociation reduces to the point that we directly experience again the original sense of identity, the primary sense of identity, it stands to reason that we would experience it as a remembrance, like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, that's how it started,
Yeah.
right? So that's how I would account for your wife's experience. I would say it's entirely natural. There is nothing pathological, nothing bizarre, nothing supernatural about it, nothing extraordinary. It's natural. I think a lot of people experience it, but they would dismiss it later because of culture bound assumptions and all that. Just as many people experience telepathy, but they would dismiss it as illusions. It's how culture plays. Culture doesn't play by changing empirical observation. Empirical observation is empirical observation. Culture plays by uh, modulating how you react to empirical observations, whether you take it seriously or not, whether you dismiss it or integrate it, whether you repress it or face it. And so culture um, biases the playing field. It's not level. That's the effect of culture. So culture will bias your wife to say it's just some kind of hypnagogic illusion or hypnopompic illusion, and then you would dismiss it, put it in a drawer, and forget about it. In other cultures, your wife would become the shaman
Yes.
because
Well,
your wife has accessed true reality, and not all people have the
that's
ability to do that.
that's how I see her, Bernardo, and that's how she sees herself. She hasn't put it in a drawer. There is this shamanic, aspect to her way of being, for sure. It's definitely true from my point of view. You mentioned that the dream, I think, and this one I find that reminded me. I find this one is so helpful to be able to explain what we're talking about to people who are completely unfamiliar with it. And you mentioned Michael Pollan in your book, who misrepresented or misreported the psychedelic report that was done by CNN and Guardian and etc. Anyway, I had Michael on the podcast, and I asked him if his experiences with psychedelics had shifted his materialism needle from 100%, and if he was now more on the side of reality is mind, not matter. And he said, no, he was still, he was closer that way, but still 60%, let's say, I think he said, materialist. And then I said, okay, here's one way to think about it. And then gave the analogy of a dream. When you're in the dream, you always experience the dream as a subject from within the dream talking to someone else, an object in a room, the world, and then you wake up and you realize it was all mind. And he got it. He's like, oh, okay, I get it. And then he asked me, which caught me off guard, so whose mind is it? Because there is that assumption, well, there's someone has to have a mind. A mind has to be within someone, in our case, a biological system. But what you're saying and what we're talking about here is, no, it's just mind. There is just mind. It's not someone's mind. It is just mind.
Correct. Michael has read my latest book months before it was released.
Oh, yeah?
It is just as much as I can say. He has he so I don't know when you interviewed him, but
Well,
if
I
you
knew he
interviewed
was
him
doing a
less than a
book. I knew because he's working on a book on consciousness, right? So it makes sense that he would reach out to you. Okay, is there anything you can reveal or not?
no.
Oh, I can't wait. I cannot wait. Oh,
No, I don't know what his final conclusions are.
oh,
But
you
the only
don't
reason I
know.
mention that is because if you would refer to analytic idealism, he would know what you're talking about.
Right.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying that he believes it or that he takes it as the most viable hypothesis. I don't know any of that. I don't know what
Right.
his position is.
So yeah, I
All I
spoke to
wanted
him a
to
couple
say
of
is
years ago. So it was probably
years
before he
ago.
read. A
Okay.
couple of years ago, I would say 2 years probably.
No, it's more recent. So no, then he wouldn't have known. But if you have him again in the podcast, you wouldn't need to cover the basic terminology. I mean, he would have a starting point that you both share. So you could speed the conversation straight to
How
the
interesting.
conclusions and implications.
Well, I'm really interested to see. But then again, he will be subject to those things that we've spoken about in terms of to acknowledge or say, actually, okay, I got it wrong. That comes with a great risk for someone with a reputation. He was Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. That's
I
and I really like Michael. I have to say, I'm very fond of
yeah,
him.
me too, me too. Mike, I I don't think I said he misrepresented it. I think he
Cut
of
and
the
paste.
many results from the scientific papers that he could pick, he picked precisely the ones that were least inconsistent with physicalism. Now, you can ask yourself, was it his choice? Was it what he was given? He interviewed scientists, and some of the same scientists that I criticize in my book, not for being malicious, but for having allowed uh, grotesque misreporting of their own conclusions. So I don't know what picture he had. So I stopped short of blaming him outright. Maybe he could have done his research a little more thoroughly. Maybe that's what I implied in the book. He's not too upset that I implied that in the book. What he told me, he said it didn't sting too much. He said,
That's nice. Yeah. I'm sure it certainly wouldn't have struck me as malicious. Like he's not that. Doesn't seem that way inclined at all. He seems like a very
no, I don't think he's malicious at all. No, he's doing the best he can, and he's very clever. But nobody in this world is perfect.
no, absolutely. Right, a couple of things, Bernardo. Very important. So you, there's obviously this cultural momentum we've spoken about in terms of materialism and the belief that mind emerges from physical property, the brain, matter. But then over the last 40 years, there have been so many experiments, etc., that have pointed in another direction. And you say, we're just not acknowledging what nature is telling us. And the most important of which, I would say, because of its recognition, is the Nobel Prize in 2022. Local realism is false. And I'll try and put it in my terms. I'm sure I probably won't get it quite right, but let's just give it a shot, which is that let me try. I'm already stumbling. So if I see this bottle, hold up this bottle, there is only a bottle. The bottle is created through the act of perception. Now, that's not to say there isn't something there, but it's not like this bottle. It doesn't have the shape, it doesn't have the color, it doesn't have the weight, etc., etc. That is all created by the act of perception, and you can't separate them. So the observer has an effect. You have given a lovely description actually about the moon, right, in the book. So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, just very brief mention. The story is a little more complicated than to say that local physical realism has been defeated. There are certain statistical properties that one would expect that are not consistent with the experiment. It's not as simple as that, but this simplification is fair enough at this level. But the key conclusion, I think, goes deeper. The original Bell experiments wouldn't differentiate between physical realism and locality, but there have been experiments done afterwards, not using Bell's inequalities, but using Tony Leggett's inequalities that were published in Foundations of Physics in 2003. And those inequalities do single out physical realism. So you can try to refute physical realism alone, independent of locality. And those experiments were done, and they refuted physical realism, independent of locality. So what the experiments seem to show is that we cannot speak of physical properties existing prior to a measurement. That measurement doesn't simply unveil pre-existing physical entities, but create those physical entities, and that before the measurement, there's no sense in talking about particles or any of that stuff. And then these 50-year-long series of experiments uh, 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 was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2022. Yeah, ostensibly for its practical applications in quantum information theory and information security and all that. But of course, it has fundamental metaphysical implications. You could call it experimental metaphysics, as Eric Cavalcanti calls it. He's one of the top physicists now studying this stuff. Um, the key thing is the following: unless you were to entertain at least one of two scientific fantasies for which there is absolutely no empirical evidence and which are, in the face of it, drastically implausible, meaning superdeterminism or Everetian multi-worlds. I'm not going to get into why they are so implausible, and there is no evidence for them. So unless you arbitrarily entertain one of these two scientific fantasies, the experiments then must be interpreted as telling you that physical realism is not true, that there are no physical properties or entities, because entities are defined in terms of their properties. There are no physical entities before a measurement. A measurement creates a physical entity, which of course raises the question: what is it that you measured? If you think only physical entities exist and they are created by a measurement, now God help you. You cannot make sense of it. What is it that measures then? If physical entities are created by measurement and only physical entities exist, how do you escape this? Only a physical entity could have made the measurement that would have created the first physical entity. Now, and then you go to Nagarjuna like Rovelli did. And you become mystical, like a professor at Harvard Divinity School that had an online engagement with me the other day. You 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 start really abstracting your way into a web of conceptual knots, and you get stuck into that recursion, and then you're off to the races. Nobody will ever see you again. You go to La La Land. um, the alternative is obvious. What you measure is not physical. Physical entities are measurement representations, like dashboard representations. Before an airplane sensors make a measurement, the dashboard shows nothing. If the sensors measure the sky, now the dashboard shows something. Physicality is what appears on the dashboard. If you don't measure, nothing appears. Duh. Right?
Yeah.
What is the big deal?
Yeah.
You just have to keep in mind that what you're measuring is not physical. So you have to accept that physicality is not all there is. Physicality are measurement representations. And of course, these representations only exist if you make a measurement, because only then there is something to represent. But the thing that is measured does not magically come into existence because of your divine act of measurement. That is woo woo, right? That is fantasy. So obviously, there had to be something there that you measured. Something had to be measured. for there to be a measurement. It's just not physical. Oh, what can be not physical? Well, mental states. What is the length in centimeters of your thought? What is the weight in kilograms of your emotion? No, your thoughts and your emotions are not describable through physical quantities, and in that sense, they are not physical. These states are what are out there. When you measure them, you get a dashboard representation of that measurement, and that's what we call physicality. There is no mind bending exercise of theoretical imagination necessary to account for this. You don't need to go to Nagarjuna. You don't need to go to the third century Buddhism. It's it's a normal rationality, you know. It's even Aristotelian logic. I'm personally an intuitionist. I'm not fully Aristotelian, but even if I were an Aristotelian, you know, I would say the vanilla Aristotelian logic. There's no woo here. But the physics is now so tempted into going into woo for all kinds of reasons. No, empirically inaccessible multiverses in which there are copies of you that have taken all the other decisions that you haven't taken in your life. No, it it's becoming science fiction, um, and our values are changing in such a way that we value science fiction above reason. Physicists are being rewarded for their fictionalizing stories because that's what leads to the whoa factor. You see, uh,
Gosh,
that's why Brian Cox is so popular
I remember
on the
we said
BBC.
this. We said this last time. I remember asking you about it. Yeah, yeah.
He explains nothing. He just makes you go, "Whoa, this guy must be very smart." And that's the problem of our culture. We now, because we lost clergy, we don't take the clergy seriously anymore. We need to replace them with the clergy of science who are infusing meaning into our lives through mysterious woo. And this is a dangerous development, in my opinion, a very dangerous development. I don't think there is any need for mind bending woo explanations for the empirically well understandable fact that yes, physicality are measurement representations. They are not there unless you measure. And what you measure is therefore not physical. What is there left? Well, mental states, which is the only thing we know. It's the only pre theoretical given of nature. It couldn't be more ordinary and understandable than this. But
Yeah.
no, we prefer the fantasies.
Yes. I mean, it is. I do understand it, and I'm sure you do, that our perceptions are so misleading. It does look like there's real stuff out there, so why would we not believe it? Which comes back to that initial point that you make, that we have to recognize that we do not see things as they are. And Donald Hoffman, who I spoke to, told me that according to evolutionary game theory, the chances we see reality as it is are zero. And I think as soon as you accept that, then this opens up in a really profound way. And
Yeah.
another thing Donald Hoffman said to me was, after we discussed the 2022 Nobel Prize, and he said that back when Einstein won it, it wasn't for theory of relativity in the first instance, and it took many years for that to seep into the culture. And he said he anticipates a similar thing happening here. The implications of, for example, the Nobel Prize in 2022 will take a long time to seep into the culture. Because I asked him, why aren't more people talking about this? This is more important than even aliens arriving, right? And and he said, well, it just is going to take the old physicists to die, but it will happen. Yeah. And you seem, from what we've spoken about, to be similarly optimistic that when the new guard comes through, or even some of the old guard with moral strength comes through, this will be seen in the same way.
Yeah. Look, there are serious, level headed physicists out there that are following the evidence wherever it leads. They just don't have YouTube channels, and they are not on the BBC because they are too busy doing physics instead of producing YouTube videos criticizing their colleagues. It's not what they are busy with. They are doing physics. I can mention names. There is a group doing what's called physics of first person perspective, which is the most pure physics you can make. It has no metaphysical assumptions. The first metaphysical assumption of traditional physics is there is an external world that is physical and which we study. Well, that's a metaphysical assumption. That's not the business of science. You don't tell yourself in advance what the world is. You just look, you make observations. So the physics of first person perspective is not the study of an external physical world. That's a metaphysical assumption that they cannot make. It's the study of what we will see next, what we will observe next. If you do physics from this metaphysically neutral perspective, you can follow the evidence where it does, without where it brings you, without confirmation bias, without metaphysical prejudice. So there is a group of physicists doing just that. But the only place where you see them on YouTube is Essential Foundation's channel, and the channel of the foundation that I lead, because we feel that they have to get visibility. Otherwise, we only see the YouTubing physicists and the BBC physicists, or the Neil deGrasse Tysons, and the science guy who has a bachelor in engineering and he's the science guy. I mean, I rather hear from the people actually doing science as opposed to the people talking about it, right? So there is more going on beneath the cacophony of media, even the cacophony of social media. And that is a reason to hope. There are level-headed, serious physicists out there doing good science, following the evidence wherever it leads, theorizing in a grounded, empirically grounded way, not fantasizing, not going woo, not trying to woo audiences in order to sell books or get more views in your YouTube video. No, these people are out there. They are working very hard. So there is reason, and they are the majority. They are not visible, but they are the majority. Scientists who are slaving away out there do not have the time to appear all the time in YouTube videos and TV shows because they're busy doing science. And like everybody else, they are in the autistic spectrum to some extent, like you and I are as well to some extent.
Yeah.
So they publish technical papers. They live in their own little world, and maybe they are not too busy trying to reach the person, the average person on the street, because they have their own dispositions, their own proclivities, and it's doing science as opposed to communicating science. And then the media may or may not pick up on their results and their thinking, and usually they will not, because it's not woo, it's not so wow, it's not quantum entanglement will blow your head, bro. It's not like that. It's like, oh, no go theorems. Of these three hypotheses we know, not all three can be true at the same time. This is what they're doing. It's level-headed stuff. It will not get you a lot of views on your physics bashing YouTube channel or your woo inducing TV show, but they are there. There is a reason for hope. But even more generally than that, Simon, I think what this all leads to is the realization that we as a species have become mad 30 to 50,000 years ago, and that madness was evolutionarily advantageous, vastly, overwhelmingly advantageous. But it is mad. It is a madness. It's a form of craziness. And the game that we play is how to be less crazy. Monkeys are not in the game of ultimate truths, of proving the existence of God logically through a syllogism. No, that's pre-Renaissance stuff. That's scholasticism stuff. We were naive. Now we are almost 1,000 years later, and we have a good chance to make less mistakes, to be less crazy than that. But that's the game in town. It's to be less crazy, and the realization that we are fundamentally a mad species, is not one to trigger fear, anxiety, or anger. It's one to trigger compassion.
Yes. Yes. What is it? Blame them not because they understand not what they do. That's basically that thing, right?
Well,
That's what he was saying.
the way I deal with it is not my own words is blame them not too much because I too am mad.
Right. Okay. That's
I just am mad in ways that I'm not aware of.
yes, of
I am
course.
aware of the ways they are mad, and therefore I have a social and moral duty to highlight the ways in which they are mad. And if you read my book, you will notice that I have a very sharp tone in the book. I don't shy away from sharp criticism. I do that not because of my character. If you knew me in person, you would see that I'm not like that at all. But it is a social tactics because the people I'm criticizing have that same tone when they criticize alternatives to physicalism. So I adopt the same tone because I don't want to come across as surrendering the rational high ground to them. So if they refer to idealism, oh, this is woo bullshit, then I'll refer to them as woo bullshit and I'll explain why. I'll take the same tone, not to grant them the rational high ground, because it would be an illusion to grant them that. I'm not fighting an uphill battle at all. If anything, it's downhill. So I'll take that tone to mirror theirs. Um, but in my heart of hearts, um, there is overwhelmingly more compassion than blame, because every time I look in the mirror, I see a human.
Yes.
And I know how much I bullshitted others and myself earlier in my life. And I know that statistically, the chance that I'm no longer bullshitting myself regarding anything is zero. The chance that I am not mad at all is zero. I am mad too. I'm just not mad in the way they are.
Yes. And that comes
And
back to my point, though, Bernardo, that what we're talking about here, though, in terms of the subject looking out from my eyes is the same as the subject looking out of your eyes. Being mad about that, everything else kind of pales in significance, because the implications of not recognizing that are things like war and murder and etc. And so it's okay to be mad in other respects, and as you say, we all are. But this particular madness has such deep and profound implications, as we see in the world right now, that I think it's like comparing a crack in the wall to the Grand Canyon, you know. But I want to finish, Bernardo, with on the dissociation point. So you often use the analogy of whirlpools. It's like this infinite ocean, and we are whirlpools within that. You can't take a whirlpool out of the ocean. It is part of the ocean, but it seems to have its own boundary and be separate from the other parts until it goes back into it. And so I want to come back a little bit to death then, because according to this, we touched on it earlier, we all tend to think it's going to be oblivion. But if you really do think about this and really do take this seriously, and as we said before, it really sinks in to the point where you can't doubt it, or you can't doubt it 99.9%, let's say something like that. Then yeah, like death is the end of dissociation. And that means, yeah, like what could be, I mean, who knows what it will be, but it's not going to be oblivion. Consciousness, I mean, you write
the
in there, don't you?
opposite.
We are never unconscious. And actually, that reminds me, I mean, I had insomnia in my 20s. And part of the reason was because that the consciousness never went anywhere. And that's what I was expecting to sort of go to sleep. I was like, how can I go to sleep? I'm always conscious. And actually, there's an intuition there. It's like, no, we are always conscious. And so people sometimes say this, oh, you're not conscious during general anesthetic. You're not conscious during sleep. Well, I mean, you're conscious of your dreams, right? Like it's just it's semantics.
Even when you're not dreaming, new research shows even when you're not dreaming, you're conscious. You have sleep thinking, you have subliminal perceptions, you have um, uh, um, uh, selfless states of experience. You can figure that out by instrument people with an EEG. And we know when people are dreaming because the EEG looks very peculiar during a dream. We know what a dream looks like. So scientists have chosen to wake people up suddenly when they are not dreaming, because the EEG lets the scientists know when they are not dreaming, and then wake people suddenly in a sleep lab and say, "Were you unconscious?" And invariably, people would say, "No, no, I was thinking about something non-immersively, or I was having a subliminal perception, or I was selfless. I didn't have a self, but I was aware of that selflessness." So this is a more or less recent study, like 15 years ago. No, no, less than 10 years ago. I think 2017. You're never unconscious during sleep. And anesthesiologists now know that you're never unconscious during, well, there is a big hypothesis being debated in anesthesiology that you're never unconscious during anesthesia. It doesn't mean that you experience the surgery. You're not in pain. They monitor your heart rate, other physiological signs of stress. You're not in pain. You're not experiencing the surgery, but you're experiencing something else. Anesthesiologist, part of the cocktail of anesthesia is a drug that prevents memory formation. It ensures that you will not remember whatever you experienced during anesthesia. Why do they add it there if you are unconscious? There is a reason they add it there, because you're experiencing something and they rather have you not remember whatever it is. It's better to think that you're totally out. We are never unconscious. All we can say is that we don't remember being conscious.
Yes. And so the implication is we will never be unconscious. And so,
Never.
when the dissociation ends and, the avatar of Bernardo and Kastrup, Bernardo and Simon and everyone else, let's say, um, melts
Ends.
into ends and melts into that broad reality. The experiencing still goes on, and therefore the implications for the way we are now suddenly become really important. That whole question of character, what you do when no one is looking, etc., become really important again. And that, if you're right, and in your lifetime the tipping point is reached and this recognition, the world would surely be transformed by the implications of this on in terms of death alone, wouldn't it?
Oh, of course. I mean, uh, I'll share you something fairly personal, but it makes sense in this context. Um, I fear death, because I know the experiencer will be there. And death is a process, like life is a process. So it goes through phases. It's not binary, it's not on and off. There is probably a transition from this localized state of consciousness or the avatar in the dream to the dreamer, to the completely delocalized state. And then you probably go through those stages of that transition. And in the early stages, you cease to be yourself, but perhaps you're the whole of humanity. And after that, you're the whole of life on Earth. And after that, the whole of life in the universe. And after that, the inanimate universe. So there is a stage that I am particularly fearful, because, when the dissociation ends, the surviving alter, the surviving subjectivity inherits the memories of all the dissociative processes. That happens with people who are cured from dissociative identity disorder. That happens when you wake up from a dream, you remember the dream. So the non dissociated subject inherits the memories of the dissociated complexes. We know that clinically, empirically. So there's plenty of reason to think the same happens after we die, that the subject we return to remembers the memories of all these levels that I talked about, the other people, the animals on planet Earth, then life on the universe. I am particularly fearful not only of the memories of all the people who have suffered greatly, particularly during our lifetimes, which are the ones that are cognitively closest to us, and therefore the memories of which we will inherit first. I think. Um, but what we are doing to animals, because we industrialized life. There are more pigs in the Netherlands than people, and even in a developed country like the Netherlands, the conditions in which they live, the brief 6 months of life which they are allowed for are horrible. They never see the sky. They have less than 1 square meter. They can't turn their butts around without knocking another pig. Female pigs are constantly pregnant, like female cows are kept constantly pregnant, produce milk and all that. Um, it's it's much more than a holocaust every day. It is a level of high efficiency industrialized suffering that is inconceivable. It is it is not a tsunami. It is a supernova of suffering that we are constantly planting in the collective unconscious, so-called unconscious, which is pretty conscious. We are creating these collective memories that we will inherit, and I dread going through that phase. Uh, I I hope I can bypass that when I die. I don't know how it works. There is reason for hope because the NDEers, most of them seem to have a positive NDE. There are the negative ones. There are the people who experience exactly something along the lines I just described. But most of them seem to come back and say it's all oneness. It was great, great love. Well, fingers crossed for that. But analytically speaking, I think there are more reasons to think that we will inherit some dreadful memory states than positive memory states, because we are making sure we are seeding the cognitive space in which we exist overwhelmingly with that, not only because of war but because of the industrialization of life. And if you go beyond the Netherlands, animals that are grown as products, they're systematically tortured by people who just have the inclination to torture. I wish somebody would collect the statistics of how many cats in the world are doused with fuel and set on fire every day by human beings who just have fun watching them run around in profound despair because they're being burned alive every day. I live with 4 cats. I know how conscious they are. I know how sophisticated conscious beings they are, perfectly capable of suffering in every form. Um, it is it, hell is being created by us every day. We are very busy with that, and it's an industrial scale. It is a massive scale what we are doing. So yeah, I'm more a Schopenhauerian in how I regard the world without romanticism than I am a mystic who thinks we will all hold hands and sing the kumbaya in the afterlife. Maybe I hope so, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I think ultimately oneness wins over, and just like a nightmare that when you wake up still affecting you, but 2 hours later you find a place for it, and it no longer makes you suffer. I think the same thing should happen. But I dread those 2 hours.
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. And just to remind, some of the final words in the book do talk about this. If you are one of those people who sees this, who gets this, who feels this, you do have a responsibility to some degree to put your hand up, because
Yeah,
this is a big deal, right? But you
yeah,
also did point out, I remember, we can relax and enjoy life because we are not going to oblivion. Yes, we might be going to, hell states, but we're not going to oblivion. That pure subjectivity is not going anywhere. So yeah,
yeah.
it's like, which
So
side do you want?
the good news is we have time. The bad news is we have endless time.
Oh, that's
That's the vertigo of eternity right there.
okay.
Yeah.
Actually, one final question, Bernardo. we haven't really touched on the ego. So the ego, and I don't want to go too big on this, but the ego, this perception of being a chooser of thoughts, etc., separate from the thoughts themselves. And there are obviously questions around free will, because if there is no chooser and thoughts are just coming up, then it's not like we are choosing necessarily, for example, torture on a mass scale or any of the bad activity until we see it. So how much influence can we have anyway if reality and life is just unfolding, and the egoic control that we seem to have is an illusion anyway?
Um, let's imagine that determinism is true. It may be true, but let's pretend that it is, just for the sake of argument, because that's the extreme case that you're bringing up, right? So let's address that worst case scenario, because if determinism is not true, then what we will discuss remains valid. It's the most testing case. It's full determinism. So let's assume it for the sake of argument. I'm a computer engineer. That was my first doctorate, and still my professional life. I just started a company doing AI hardware, doing chips. It's been my life for almost 3 decades next to philosophy. Philosophy is something imposed on me. I don't know where that came from. No, by choice, when I turned 17, I went to university to study computer engineering. A computer is a fully deterministic system. We know exactly what it will do under every circumstance, except cosmic rays. But we design the signal to noise ratio in such a way that even when cosmic rays affect the computer, they will not change the predictability of the computer. Um, so every chip is deterministic. The computer as a whole is deterministic, and it has many chips. And the chips talk to one another. The outputs of one chip become inputs of another chip, and the outputs of that chip become inputs to yet another chip, whose outputs may even go back to the first chip. It's all an interconnected web of deterministic agents. Every chip is deterministic. They talk to one another deterministically, therefore, the whole system is deterministic. But if one chip in that web stops producing outputs, the system stops working, right? So the determinism of the system is not a reason for the chips to not do their task. They still have to do what they do. If they stop doing it, the system stops working, even though it's completely deterministic. So we as agents, even if determinism is true, and we too are deterministic agents, we still have to play our role in the deterministic web. I still have to try to convince you that physicalism is false and idealism is true. I still have to ask you to play your moral role once you have seen the light. Because if you don't, the system stops working, even though it's by hypothesis deterministic. So even if what we choose, we do choose, we always choose. The question is, could we choose differently than we did? And you could say no. For as long as we are who we are, we would choose as we choose. But even in that case, you still have to do your part. And perhaps you would deterministically choose to do your part because I asked you to. And my asking you was also deterministic. And we still have to go through that dance, just like the chips in the computer still have to talk to one another.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Wow, that's a
I
mind bend.
still have to say what I had to say. You still have to read what I had to read, what you had to read, and you still have to do what you have to do afterwards,
Yeah.
deterministic or not. So the conclusion is, determinism being true or not doesn't take our responsibility away. There is even a better reason for that. Um, even if the universe is deterministic, it is not computationally reducible. In other words, we cannot predict what the universe will do, because to do that would require a computer bigger and more complex than the universe. So the only way to know where the universe is deterministically going is to let it go there and find out. So again, it doesn't mean, it doesn't matter at all if determinism is true or not, because none of the conclusions will change. We will still not know where things are going until we get there, and we still have to choose what we choose, regardless. So the whole question of determinism is a non starter. It does not matter. It does not matter for the meaning of your life. It does not matter for the choices you make, for the way you pick. You always have to make choices, whether they are deterministic or not, doesn't matter. Not even God knows where this whole thing is going,
Yeah.
because the universe is computationally irreducible. The only way the universe will know where it's going is for it to go there and get there. Only then it will find out that, oh, this was my deterministic destiny. The only way to find out is to go through the journey. You still have to go through the journey. You still have to do your thing. I still have to do my thing. And we still have to communicate. There is no way around it. So you might as well forget it. The whole question of determinism, you might as well forget it. It's irrelevant.
I love that. That was brilliant, Bernardo. I almost want to get up and clap. That reminds me of the Anthony de Mello quote, I think it is, which is something along the lines of enlightenment is cooperating with the inevitable, or something along those lines, which I think was quite a nice line that I like. Anyway, yeah, wow, what a wonderful way to finish, Bernardo. Such a pleasure to speak with you. Congratulations again on your book. Like I said, I'm going to be buying it for people. Please, anyone listening, buy and read this book, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. It's absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I hope we get
Thank
to
you.
chat again soon, Bernardo. It's just been so much fun. I could do it all day long.
It's been a pleasure. I'm gladly would do it again. Yes. Thanks for having me, Simon.
My pleasure.